Chapter 1368 Death Imprint. Death Salinger, who was pacing around the river of eternal darkness, looked at Klein, who was enveloped in the grayish-white cocoon. His eyes that had pale white flames that were about to be extinguished instantly reflected the golden bird-shaped accessory on Klein's chest. In the next second, a deep roar came from his rotting mouth, reverberating above the river, causing the entirety of Calderon City to visibly shake. The distributary that occasionally rose up or plunged down, sometimes dark and sometimes pale white, reached the end of the stone staircase with the rising of tides, surging towards Klein. During this process, the illusory tide fused with the grayish-white fog, creating a similar color. The grayish-white torrent slammed into Klein's body repeatedly, but it failed to destroy the cocoon around him. Death Salinger's rotting body took steps to the edge of the distributary, but he couldn't escape no matter what. All he could do was stand there and roar wildly. Klein's gaze swept past him, as he looked at the blurry figures loitering around the banks. One of them had already been swept to the center of the distributary by the surging tide. They couldn't help but sink to the bottom of the river, melting like ice. The remaining ones didn't show any fear as they maintained their blank and lost state, moving back and forth endlessly. At a glance, Klein saw many familiar figures. They were the same person, Isaac Eggers, with his bronze skin and soft facial features. This death console seemed to have dissociated into multiple selves. They constantly paced between the pale white stone pillars on both sides of the river of eternal darkness. As Klein's heart stirred, his right leg suddenly turned cold. He subconsciously lowered his head and saw a pale white hand. The palm penetrated the grayish-white cocoon and grabbed his calf. And the owner of the palm floated in the surging torrent was like a water ghost as it attempted to pull Klein into the depths of the water. Its attack could actually ignore the aura of Sapphira Castle. Sensing Klein's gaze, the pale white palm's owner raised his head to reveal his face. He had black hair and brown eyes. His facial features were ordinary and he had a scholarly air. Klein Moretti. The water ghost was Klein Moretti. In the next second, Klein's left leg, right shoulder, and left arm were grabbed by different pale white hands. This made him feel cold all over as his spirit body seemed to freeze. He couldn't even use all his Beyonder powers. It was impossible to resist. The three pale white hands belonged to different blurry figures, while the different blurry figures all had the same face. Klein Moretti's face. Under the pull of the four water ghosts, Klein's body gradually separated from the grayish-white cocoon and sank into the torrent. His body became colder and colder, and his thoughts gradually fell into silence. His vision gradually darkened, and eventually, there were only dark ebbing waves. Above the gray fog, in the ancient palace, Klein's consciousness returned to his original body. Then, without any hesitation, he extended his palm and used the power of Sapphira Castle to steal an item from the ladder through his connection with the historical projection. A golden beam of light flashed as Klein held the golden bird-shaped accessory. At the same time, he stopped maintaining the historical void projection. The drowning figure disappeared from the eternal night flood. It can ignore the aura of Sapphira Castle, which means that those four figures truly are me. But why would I be trapped in the stream of the river of eternal darkness, pacing about endlessly? Four figures, four figures. Klein's expression was solemn as he gently tapped the edge of the long mottled table. He gained some inspiration amidst the tapping. The words four, souls, and death corresponded to the reality that he had died 4 times and had revived 4 times. Of course, after becoming an attendant of mysteries, the 4 resurrection opportunities had been reset again. Every time I die, regardless of whether I successfully revive or not, I will leave an imprint in the river of eternal darkness? I died 4 times. So there are 4 figures wandering the banks of the river of eternal darkness? Klein roughly grasped the crux of it before he sighed inwardly. The river of eternal darkness is indeed a sapphira. As expected of the symbol of death, repose, destination, endpoint, and darkness. This is what the goddess meant when she pointed out that I'll encounter a different kind of danger? When the historical projection was drowned, I suffered some mental damage. If my mental state was unstable, I might have suffered some terrible consequences by now. Based on this deduction, Klein had a brand new understanding of the many Azek figures and the wandering Death Salinger. They were the corresponding imprints of death. Mr. Azek has indeed died many times in the process of searching for his memories, but he comes back to life every time. According to the present situation, although an undying doesn't die, it leaves behind a lot of hidden dangers. Once the number of deaths reaches a certain level, their true bodies might be attracted to the river of eternal darkness one day, ending up as one of the figures that wander around there for an eternity. Only Salinger's figure is there. This means that, after accommodating the uniqueness, his death imprint also becomes unique. As Klein's thoughts raced through his mind, he became worried about Mr. Azek's state of survival. And there were two solutions to resolving this problem. One was to make Azek's soul whole and make him stop repeating his resurrection process. And second, to help the Evernight goddess become a great old one and gain control of the river of eternal darkness. Heh. Perhaps this is another binary choice. When the goddess becomes a great old one, there's no need for her to make use of half of Mr. Azek's soul again. Klein reined in his thoughts and focused his attention on his goal. He had entered the depths of Calderon City, not to resolve the death imprint of Death Salinger, and destroy any chances of him reviving. Instead, he was here to retrieve the river water from the river of eternal darkness. Clearly, the illusory tide's water that flows out of the river doesn't work. It's only an aura that flows out, not the river water itself. Also, water that has fused with the grayish-white fog won't do either. It's not pure enough, so it wouldn't be able to accomplish the desired effect. From the looks of it, only when the distributary turns back into its deep and dark state can I get the water. There's definitely no way to get it from the main river. That grayish-white fog is definitely a solid barrier. Klein quickly formulated a plan based on his analysis. That was to avoid going close to the river of eternal darkness, and not attract the attention of Death Salinger. He would wait for the distributary's water to recede and turn dark before he headed over before allowing his 4 death imprints to drag his historical projection to the bottom of the river. During this process, the historical projection would seize the opportunity and use the golden bird-shaped accessory to scoop the river water. Then, he would return his consciousness back to Sapphira Castle. Using the powers of theft, as well as the close connection between the two items, he could take away the golden bird-shaped accessory. After considering the finer details to the procedure, Klein returned to Calderon City and summoned his historical void projection. He repeated the previous process and soon returned to the stone tablet next to the giant bronze bird statue. He walked down the grayish-white stone steps, step by step. The aura of Sapphira Castle around him gradually thickened, turning into a thin cocoon. It didn't take long before Klein arrived at the end of the staircase. He saw the river of eternal darkness flowing in the void, the pale white columns on both banks, and the countless blurry figures that lingered at the banks of the distributary. This time, he wasn't in a hurry to go forward. He left the staircase and waited patiently at the same spot for the distributary's water to recede. The grayish-white colors faded and the water darkened. Right now, Klein's figure flashed as he stole the distance and appeared in Death Salinger's blind spot. Without any surprise, as his body sank into the river of eternal darkness, the pale white hands immediately penetrated the aura of Sapphira Castle and grabbed his limbs. His 4 death imprints appeared around him, eager to drag him to the bottom of the river. Klein's head submerged under the dark river water, making his body turn cold as his thoughts turned still. Before he completely lost his senses, transparent and distorted maggots crawled out from Klein's neck. They quickly crawled to the side of the golden bird-shaped accessory, clustered around it, and lifted it up, preparing to scoop the water of the river of eternal darkness. At that moment, a massive shadow appeared in the swirling illusory river in front of Klein. It was a giant bird floating in the water, one that was completely submerged by the river of eternal darkness's distributary. The giant bird's surface was covered with white flames, and the feathers formed from mysterious patterns, but most of them had been melted away by the river of eternal darkness. The exposed parts were pitch black and rotten with pale yellow pus on the surface. The giant bird's eyes seemed to be made of bronze, and layers of illusory doors were hidden within. Phoenix ancestor Greggrace, the ancient death who had opened up the underworld. In front of Greggrace's eyes, a bronze beam burst out, enveloping the golden bird-shaped accessory and Klein's historical projection in a bid to drag them over together. After weighing his current situation, Klein instantly made a decision and gave up the attempt of scooping the river water. His consciousness immediately returned to Sapphira Castle, and he stole the golden, bird-shaped accessory. His historical projection dissipated. There's danger in the water too. The ancient god, Phoenix ancestor Greggrace, has completely sunk into the river of eternal darkness. If the goddess can truly accommodate the uniqueness of the death pathway, and if Salinger can't use that opportunity to revive in his body, he should also sink into the water like Greggrace. And the death imprint of Greggrace will melt further. Klein silently sighed as he modified the plan. Following that, he summoned the historical void projection and returned to the end of the stairs. After waiting for a while, when Death Salinger turned around and slowly walked towards the bank, Klein suddenly stole the distance and appeared in front of him. In the next second, Salinger let out a low growl, rapidly increasing the flow of the distributary. At the same time, Klein was grabbed by his death imprints and forcefully dragged to the bottom of the river. He sensed the phoenix ancestor, Gregrace. Like before, Gregrace's bronze eyes lit up. However, what enveloped this light wasn't Klein and the golden bird-shaped accessory, but Death Salinger. Grafting. Seizing this brief opportunity, the worms of spirit crawled out from Klein's historical projection and lifted the golden bird-shaped accessory. The bronze eye of the accessory also released a beam of light, scooping up a tiny portion of the river water. In the next moment, Klein's consciousness returned to Sapphira Castle. He raised his hand and retrieved the accessory. Phew, I'm finally done. Looking at the golden bird-shaped accessory in his hand, he slowly exhaled. As the owner of Sapphira Castle, this mission wasn't too difficult. As long as he didn't rashly enter with his main body, he could rely on repeated failures to accumulate experience and figure out the situation. And if it wasn't for the fact that there were 2 deaths in the distributary of the River of Eternal Darkness, one wandering and the other sinking, Klein wouldn't have failed twice. Chapter 1369 Pomp. After weighing the bird-shaped, golden accessory in his hand, Klein quickly returned to the real world. He casually picked an empty plot of land and set up an altar to hold a sacrificial ritual. With regards to the other secrets hidden in Calderon City, as well as the loitering figures around the River of Eternal Darkness, he temporarily didn't have any thoughts of starting a deeper exploration of it. This was because he still had more important matters to prepare for. He also had a key question to ask the Evernight Goddess. Soon, he held the ritual and allowed the candlelight and spirituality materials to fuse together, forming a door of sacrifice and bestowment. Without any hesitation, Klein placed the bird-shaped, golden accessory into the wind, allowing it to slowly pass through the mysterious door and vanish into the endless darkness. In the next second, he sharply noticed that he had been dragged into a dream. In the center of the dreamscape was a Gothic palace that seemed to blend with the darkness around it. Its details were exquisite, its color dim, but it was still gorgeous. Klein passed through bushes of night vanilla and slumber flowers before stepping into the palace. In the deepest part of the hall, the Evernight Goddess was sitting on an ancient high-back chair. Xueqi was still wearing the layered black dress that didn't seem complicated. The sparkling spots on the dress reflected the dome and the walls, and the pillars of the palace created a quiet and dreamy starry sky. The Evernight Goddess, whose face seemed to be covered in layers of fishnet veils, held the bird-shaped, golden accessory and slowly stood up. She walked down the stairs to Klein. Her voice sounding like a lullaby. "What do you have to ask?" Klein politely took off his top hat and bowed slightly. "I want to know if the grayish-white fog that envelopes the River of Eternal Darkness has something to do with that Lord of the Mysteries. That was also the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings." Although he couldn't see the Evernight Goddess's face clearly, Klein felt like she was smiling when he looked straight at her. "Yes." Furthermore, not only is the River of Eternal Darkness enveloped by the grayish-white fog, but the city behind Bansi Harbor, and the entire western continent is enveloped by the same grayish-white fog. Klein hesitated for a moment before saying, "This is a kind of seal?" The Evernight Goddess's dream projection nodded. "That's right. Apart from Sapphira Castle and the Chaos Sea, all the other spherotes were sealed in the western continent by that mysterious Lord of the Mysteries. River of Eternal Darkness, Brood Hive, City of Calamity, Tenebrous World, Nation of Disorder, Knowledge More, and Key of Light have all been sealed in the western continent by the celestial worthy? Isn't this too much? What pomp! It's no wonder that the city behind Bansi Harbor's door is like the former Shanghai. This is the City of Calamity affecting that city in the real world, as well as Bansi. Then, to a certain extent it has caused certain changes?" Klein was enlightened and amazed. Back when he saw the scene behind the door in Bansi, he had suspected that it had something to do with the western continent. Furthermore, according to the clue that Bansi was the headquarters of Red Angel Medici's family, he suspected that behind the door was the reflection of the Sapphira, the City of Calamity. After a moment of silence, Klein didn't conceal his feelings. He sighed and said, "The power of that Lord of the Mysteries far exceeds my imagination. How could such a great old one, who is known as one of the pillars of the universe, silently perish?" The Evernight goddess's dream projection shook her head. It wasn't silent. From the clues that were available, he died together with the God Almighty of ancient times. That God Almighty's corpse formed the first blasphemy slate in the Chaos Sea. And beside it was the uniqueness of the Marauder pathway. In other words, in the middle of the first epoch, the Lord of the Mysteries and God Almighty had a battle that was abnormally intense but didn't cause much of a stir. In the end, both perished? This can explain why the ancient sun god had the uniqueness or grazed uniqueness of the Marauder pathway when he walked out of the Chaos Sea. It was ripped off by the ancient God Almighty from the Lord of the Mysteries. Amidst his thoughts, Klein asked in puzzlement, why would they want to kill each other? They are both pillars and aren't from similar pathways. There shouldn't be any life and death conflicts that cannot be resolved. The Evernight goddess's dream projection said gently, convergence is an instinct. The higher the level, the stronger the instinct. That Lord of the Mysteries and God Almighty of ancient times were unable to restrain themselves from converging together, becoming the embodiment of the entire universe, which is also the innate instinct of the original creator. The crazier one becomes the stronger they become? And beyond cunning, powerful, terrifying, and filled with wisdom, there's such a side to the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings? Klein thought for a moment and said, that Lord of the Mysteries and God Almighty of ancient times are, in essence, different sides of the original creator? The Evernight goddess's dream projection said in a comforting voice, using the same existence but different personas as an analogy will be more accurate. The original creator was the maker of the universe, and also its destroyer. It is both day and also night. It's the light of holiness, and also the decadent abyss. It is an amalgamation of all contradicting concepts and symbolism. That's why he naturally has a tendency to be dissociative in a way that cannot be controlled. Once he splits, there will be a strong trend towards convergence. In a time more ancient than the era we lived in our past lives, the original sleeping creator had naturally split into multiple personas. They were also in a state of slumber, but they began to use the authority and beyonder characteristics they controlled to influence the world, making many preparations for the true dissociation when the original creator awakened. Here the most powerful and active ones were God Almighty and the Lord of the Mysteries. The latter had another honorific name in the Western continent. In the early mid-stages of the first epoch, they should have used different methods to grasp the additional spherote. This made their inclination to converge more intense, making it impossible for them to control themselves, and began taking actions against each other. According to the ancient sun god's research, the pillar of support is the highest level of stability one can achieve. If a great old one exceeds this limit, just accommodating an additional Sapphira will lead to being controlled by the convergence instinct in an irreversible manner. No one knows the exact situation of the battle. Even the 7 lights of the spirit world do not know. We only know that, from that fateful moment onwards, the 2 great old ones known as the pillars vanished completely. As for the other spherote other than the Chaos Sea and Sapphira Castle, they were sealed by Sapphira Castle's powers in the Western continent. That was once the territory ruled by the Lord of the Mysteries. This setup led to a problem. It was that, before the reappearance of the Lord of the Mysteries and God Almighty, and before removal and breaking of the Western continent's seal, no sequence 0 in this world could become a great old one to resist the outer deities. As the apocalypse approaches, this problem will force all the true deities to nurture a Lord of the Mysteries or God Almighty. And the former Lord of the Mysteries and God Almighty are very likely to awaken in their bodies. Therefore, the sealing of the other spherotes was done deliberately by the celestial worthy, preventing the later sequence 0 true deities from deliberately avoiding this pathway, killing the chances of the birth of a new Lord of the Mysteries. And as long as a new Lord of the Mysteries is born, he has a high chance of being revived and completely awakening. Isn't this too sinister? From a certain point of view, there's no need to be afraid of others knowing this arrangement. The more entities that know of it, the more they will be inclined to quickly support the growth of a Lord of the Mysteries, so as to prevent them from only having a few years towards the end to gain control of their corresponding spherote. The more Klein thought about it, the more terrifying the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings appeared. This made him sigh inwardly. As expected of a pillar that can make the genie fall into such a predicament to this day. Klein immediately asked, then why didn't you support the growth of a Lord of the Mysteries in the 4th epoch? He actually knew the answer to this question. As time passed, as the original creator's different personas, the celestial worthy and God Almighty will have their wills constantly weaken. The closer they got to the apocalypse, the weaker the corresponding will became. This made those of the future be able to resist and suppress them, and avoid losing themselves. This could be proven by the fact that Adam had waited until recently to advance to visionary. The Evernight goddess's dream projection revealed a smile. Back then, Amon and Bethel were unwilling. All of them wished to make all sorts of preparations, hoping to make the attempt when the apocalypse was approaching. As for Salinger, he planned to use the River of Eternal Darkness to fuse with the Red Priest's uniqueness to create a brand new Great Old One path. Then he went mad. He wasn't able to resist the desire for converging the Twilight and Evernight pathway. Death was also forced into such circumstances. On the one hand, the apocalypse was only 1,000 years or so away, and on the other hand, the River of Eternal Darkness had been sealed by the celestial worthy, a pillar. This prevented him from attempting to control it. It's too sinister, too much. Klein couldn't help but inwardly criticize the celestial worthy. At this moment, the Evernight goddess's dream projection continued. The seal on the western continent is gradually weakening with time. The Spherote will instinctively or consciously use their symbolism to corrode the uniqueness and high-sequence beyonder characteristics that land on them to influence the outside world. The first to seep out energy was the River of Eternal Darkness. In the second epoch, it formed a distributary through Greg race. After that, in the fourth epoch, traces of more Spherote began to appear on the northern and southern continents and the islands over the 5 seas. This is an important factor hidden behind many of the anomalies in the fourth epoch. The Spherote had indirectly exacted their influence through the seal in the fourth epoch. It's no wonder Adam said that my understanding of the fourth epoch's history isn't deep enough. From the looks of it, Bansi Harbor retained the elven customs not because it was an elven settlement, but also because of other factors. Klein thought for a few seconds before smiling. I roughly understand. Is that why you've been helping me all this while? Chapter 1370 Decisive. The Evernight goddess's dream projection replied with a smile. If it's just to nurture a Lord of the Mysteries, I should be betting on Amon. At the very least, the chances of him succeeding is much higher than yours. Without waiting for Klein to ask any further, Sheep continued with a voice as ethereal as a dream. The era that was buried in the past is a memory shared between us, and also the critical period in which our humanity was born, sprouted, and nourished. Even if I've had a long life, it still remains my fondest of memories. You have its imprint in you, so I'm more willing to help you. The love for the house extends even to the crows perching on its roof. Klein made a conclusion in the form of an idiom. At that moment, he recalled the words Emperor Roselle had written in his diary. Home. In his wistful silence, the dream projection of the Evernight goddess switched to saying, when you're ready, you can go to the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range anytime. Of course, it's your freedom to choose. No one will force you, and no one can force you either. You can choose to stop at a certain stage and not become a Great Old One, nor allow the Lord of the Mysteries to awaken in your body. Then, at the last moment of the apocalypse, you can bring the people and objects you want to protect and wander to other planets in other solar systems to avoid the attention of the outer deities, and create another civilization. Klein had long thought of this problem. After a moment of silence he said, I'm not sure if Roselle had said one thing. You can hide for a moment, but you can't hide forever. He was speaking in Jotun with the Evernight goddess, so it was a little odd when translating the proverb. Escaping was just a temporary strategy. It couldn't be used as a long-term plan. After a pause, Klein continued. Although the universe is vast and without an end, the outer deities are clearly more familiar with it than we are. They're also stronger, directly representing a certain aspect of the universe. It's very difficult to avoid their pursuit. Besides, even if we succeed, peace will only last for some time. The recreated civilization will be destroyed in less than 1,000 years. When that happens, we won't even have the chance to become Great Old Ones, never capable of any form of self-redemption. This was because if one wanted to successfully escape during the invasion of the outer deities, they had to give up all the Spherote. Otherwise, they would definitely become the focus of their attention. Let alone wandering the cosmos, even withstanding the first wave of attacks was an unknown. The Evernight goddess's dream projection spoke slowly, apart from the items ripped from the outer deities. Only taking away the uniquenesses and high-sequence beyonder characteristics of the other pathways might not necessarily garner the attention of the outer deities. They wouldn't spend too much time searching. You also said that it's not necessarily the case. The outer deities should still have a certain desire for the uniqueness and high-sequence beyonder characteristics of similar pathways. This can help them approach the level of a pillar, Klein replied calmly. We can't place our hopes on their feelings. They aren't benevolent. The Evernight goddess's dream projection nodded and said, "In this aspect, you're more aware than Roselle. Of course, it's because he had learned of the great old ones and the outer deities a little too late." Sheep continued, "You have another choice. Use Pala's method to personally lower your level and let Amon steal Sapphira Castle. This way, you can live well as a Sequence 1 angel. You don't have to constantly worry that the Lord of the Mysteries will awaken in you. It won't be that exhausting." In the Church of Evernight's Bible, there was the division of angels and archangels. Klein had always guessed that the latter referred to Sequence 1, and today, he had finally obtained confirmation. Of course, this was only the standard of one church, not necessarily the rest. After hearing the Evernight goddess's words, Klein fell silent for a long time before asking, "Can Amon be trusted?" The Evernight goddess's dream projection said frankly, "I can't give you a definite answer." Klein asked again, "If the Lord of the Mysteries awakens in Amon's body, will he take back all the high sequence beyonder characteristics of the seer, marauder, and apprentice pathways?" "I don't know," the Evernight goddess's dream projection replied in the same tone. Klein fell silent again. After a while he said, "Personally, I don't wish to become a great old one, but I can't let down and betray those existences who have placed their bets on me. They have more or less helped me. Once Amon becomes the Lord of the Mysteries, he will definitely help the ancient sun god retrieve the uniqueness and Sequence 1 beyonder characteristic from the Lord of Storms and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, causing their deaths. Besides, Amon is a reckless god." The Evernight goddess's dream projection nodded slightly and said, "Your humanity has been maintained well." After making up his mind, Klein freed himself from his low spirit state. He smiled and said, "If I hadn't maintained my humanity, and allowed the godhood to gain an advantage, I would have also made a similar choice. That's because a godhood's instinct is convergence upon oneself." The Evernight goddess's dream projection gently chuckled. "Make your preparations. Meet Antigonus as soon as possible." Klein nodded and suddenly recalled something. He hurriedly asked, "Has Amon already used Mr. Door's ritual to accommodate the uniqueness of the apprentice pathway?" The Evernight goddess's dream projection slowly replied, "If it were another existence, then definitely not. But if it's Amon, there's a 50% chance. He likes to take risks and seek thrills." Klein didn't say another word as he watched the Evernight goddess's projection vanish before him as the dream gently collapsed. The altar that he had yet to clear occupied his vision again. To him, heading to the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range to face the Antigonus family's ancestor didn't require much preparation from him. He would mainly rely on Sapphira Castle to produce an avatar to steal the Attendant of Mysteries beyonder characteristic, the one from Zeratul, that he hadn't digested yet, allowing his main body to be in a unique state that could accommodate the uniqueness. As his mental state stabilized, even without Zeratul's remnant mental imprint, Klein could still rely on his humanity, consciousness, and anchors to barely suppress the partial consciousness of the celestial worthy. However, before that, Klein's spiritual intuition told him that he needed to do something. After looking around, he tidied up the altar and dragged Dwayne Dantes out of the fog of history. Sitting at the table, Klein spread out a piece of paper and wrote a letter to Mr. Azik. As it hadn't been a while since he wrote the previous letter, there wasn't much content. He only mentioned the river of eternal darkness that was situated underground in Calderon City, as well as the death imprints on both banks of the distributary. He emphasized the numerous Azik eggers he had seen, and his guesses. After folding the letter, Klein took out Azik's copper whistle and blew at it. The skeleton messenger appeared at the size of a normal human. It knelt down on one knee and opened its palm. After Klein handed the letter to it, he took out a gold coin from Sapphira Castle. "This is to thank you for all the work you've done. If you can't accept it, hand it to your master and let him decide." This gold coin was one of the transformed gold coins that had been tainted by the aura of Sapphira Castle. He had already used one of them to pay Miss Messenger's fee, and he had lost one to Marek when they played cards. The skeleton messenger was stunned for nearly 5 seconds, but he didn't dare disobey Klein's words. He clasped the letter and the gold coin with his bony fingers. It disintegrated and fell to the ground like a waterfall before drilling into the ground. Following that, Klein took out another gold coin and placed it in his pocket. At the same time, he made the Worms of Spirit on duty in Sapphira Castle to take a look at a certain crimson star. East Balam, in a cathedral belonging to the Evernight goddess. As the first batch of demigods participating in the besieging of the Rose School of Thought, Leonard Mitchell had already used a sealed artifact to reach the southern continent. However, he had no progress for the time being. This was because the Rose School of Thought demigods seemed to sense the danger in the air as they simultaneously hid themselves. This made Leonard have no choice but to wait patiently, ready to answer the call of any dispatches. While he had nothing to do, he wore his red glove and entered the cathedral's prayer hall. He did his daily prayer in a rather devout manner. In the dark and serene environment, he seemed to fall asleep. After an unknown period of time, Leonard opened his eyes and stood up. He walked down the aisle towards the door. At that moment, he saw a familiar figure. It was Klein Moretti, wearing a top hat and formal suit with black hair and brown eyes. Leonard's pupils dilated as his brows pricked up. Klein, who was also praying, lowered his hands and stood up. He walked past him and slowly approached the altar. During this process, neither of them spoke, as if the other party was just a stranger. After reaching the donation box near the altar, Klein took out a gold coin from his pocket and threw it in with a serious expression. Then, he changed direction and left the cathedral from another door. Leonard stood in the middle of the aisle and watched this scene with a puzzled look. He frowned slightly. At this moment in his mind, Pallas Zorost's slightly aged voice echoed. "Find a chance to get that gold coin." Backlund, in a particular house. Willa Septon held a silver spoon and focused on digging at the pale green ice cream in front of him. Suddenly he extended his left hand to block the side of the food. On the chair beside him, Dwayne Dantes's figure instantly appeared. "I seem to have missed your birthday twice," Klein said with a smile. "This is a belated present." As he spoke, he took out a gold coin and pushed it to Willa Septon. "This is a lucky gold coin for you." Will was stunned for 2 seconds before muttering, "The gift celebrating my birth was a lucky amulet. For a birthday gift, it's a lucky gold coin. You really don't have any creativity." As he spoke, he reached out his chubby hand and quickly took the gold coin. Klein smiled, stood up, and vanished. Chapter 1371. Who are allies and who are foes? Biome. Inside the Church of the Sea God. After the Mass, Alger Wilson returned to his room and saw a figure appear by the window. It was Gehrman Sparrow in a top hat and trench coat. Without waiting for Alger to speak, Klein took 2 steps forward and solemnly said, "I have come under Mr. Fool's orders." He habitually acted as the attendant of mysteries. Alger immediately lowered his head and pressed his right hand to his left chest. "Praise Mr. Fool." Klein nodded slightly and took out an item from the junk pile of Sapphira Castle. Alger's eyes immediately reflected a short scepter made of bones. The tip of the scepter was embedded with tiny blue gems. A small number of them were dyed black, and a small number was covered in the light of dawn. Around it were countless pure points of light, and the sounds of illusory prayers emitted from it, stacked and holy. Alger's eyes widened as he couldn't help but reveal a hint of greed. As a Sequence 4 demigod of the Sailor Pathway, he was extremely certain that the white bone scepter before him was the symbol of the sea god's identity, level, and strength. As he endured the slight dizziness from the prayers, he cast his gaze at the world Gehrman Sparrow, waiting for the deity's attendant to speak. Klein raised the sea god's scepter with one hand and said with a solemn expression, "This is Mr. Fool's gift and a sign of trust, as well as a reward for protecting a large number of believers. No matter what happens in the future, you are to keep following Mr. Fool's instructions and do your best to complete the missions he gives." Alger acutely sensed the hidden meaning. He suspected that Mr. Fool would encounter something in the future, causing him to suffer injuries or enter a nadir state. At the thought that he had already left the Church of Storms and had no way out, Alger pressed his right hand to his left chest and replied loudly, "My faith lies only with Mr. Fool." Upon seeing this, Klein secretly nodded before repeating what he had said to Miss Justice and Miss Judgment. This made Alger heave a sigh of relief. After all, knowing what might happen in the future was better than not knowing anything. Without hesitation, he repeated his words in a serious tone. Klein handed the sea god's scepter to him. "You should get used to this sealed artifact and the daily life as a sea god. Once you finish digesting the cataclysmic Entura potion, use it to concoct the potion. The prior acting will reduce the difficulty of advancing." In fact, Klein could now remove the grafting and transfer the concept of sea god, which was directed at him in Sapphira Castle, to Alger, allowing him to directly become half a sea god. It would allow him to better adapt to his identity and better act in advance. However, considering how he was about to accommodate the Fool's uniqueness, he needed sufficient anchors to balance the consciousness of the celestial worthies awakening. He couldn't be missing the sea god's believers. Klein decided to wait until his condition had stabilized before completely transferring everything that was related to Sea God. Currently, Alger was an attendant more suitable to wield the authority, helping the deity listen and respond to prayer without enjoying the corresponding anchors and identity. The Sea God scepter's owner was still Klein, as everything still pointed at him. This was the miraculous use of grafting. Alger suppressed his excitement and joy as he answered Gehrman's sparrow sincerely and received the Sea God scepter. Then, he deliberated and asked, "What negative effects does this sealed artifact have?" "Mr. Fool has already applied certain seals to it. The negative effects of the Sea God scepter have been greatly reduced," Klein said simply. "It will only make the wielder more irritable and cause the spirit to be in a certain state of chaos. In addition, it will drain the blood of the surrounding creatures every month. You can fly to the sea or an uninhabited island ahead of time." "That's still manageable." Alger secretly heaved a sigh of relief before asking what beyonder powers the scepter had. After Klein briefly described it, he vanished. In the ancient palace above the fog. After finishing the additional preparations, Klein sat on the fool's chair and conjured a piece of goatskin and a dark red fountain pen. He began analyzing the possible developments at the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range when he faced the Antigonus family's ancestor. If everything goes smoothly, and I enter the final stage of accommodating the fool's uniqueness, the goddess will definitely have to remove the concealment. This is because this is the only way to allow the region to interact with reality, allowing fate to connect, thus achieving the effect of fooling fate. From Mr. Door's apotheosis ritual, the commotion caused by accommodating a uniqueness is definitely not trivial. Once it's not concealed, this matter will definitely be detected by the other deities. Furthermore, those who are concerned about this matter must have been watching the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range recently. Once there are any changes there, they will immediately know. In such a situation, there's no doubt that there will be interference, destruction, assistance, and support. It's very important to find out who the foes and allies are. Otherwise, there's no way to make targeted preparations. The goddess is definitely on my side. If Xueqi were an enemy, I would have been concealed countless times. It's impossible for me to grow to this level. To put it simply, she had many opportunities to sell me out. Furthermore, she could sell it at a very good price previously. Furthermore, to her, it wouldn't affect her ability to support who becomes the Lord of the Mysteries. That's why she can make a decision based on her preferences. Adam is currently unable to bypass the seal and obtain the River of Eternal Darkness. The ones who do not wish for Amon to become the Lord of the Mysteries the most are the Eternal Blazing Sun, the Lord of Storms, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. Once someone attempts to destroy my ritual to accommodate the fool's uniqueness, they would definitely help me and directly provide help. Apart from these four true deities, the remaining sequence zeros are Visionary Adam and the true creator are Amon's father. The probability of helping him is definitely higher than them being on the sidelines. Earth Mother has placed a bet on me through Emlyn, but it's not necessarily the case that she would definitely help me at the critical moment. To her, waiting patiently for the outcome when there are no interests at play is the best choice. The primordial demonist condition is odd. It's possible for her to make any choice. The attitude of the god of steam and machinery is ambiguous. It's more likely for him to remain neutral or privately make a deal with Amon and Adam. I don't have any chips to move him. Other than these true deities, there are some uncommon sequence zeros or the consciousnesses in existence that are nearly at sequence zero. The Lord of the Abyss, also known as the dark side of the universe, is suspected to have been invaded by the Mother Tree of Desire. He would occasionally respond to the prayers of the Blood Sanctify sect. It has been a long time since he exerted any influence on the real world. Likewise, the Chained God is in a similar situation. What they will do will only depend on the Mother Tree of Desire's thoughts. And to the outer deities, delaying the birth of a Lord of the Mysteries should be a consensus. Under such circumstances, stopping me from being able to accommodate the fool's uniqueness will only cause me to be at an absolute disadvantage in the competition with Amon, allowing the competition to quickly determine a winner. The most plausible strategy of the Mother Tree of Desire is tacit consent. She might even help me to accommodate the fool's uniqueness, preventing the scale between me and Amon from tilting. After that, she will repeatedly destroy our inclinations and attempts to converge, delaying the birth of the Lord of the Mysteries to the apocalypse. The Red Angel evil spirit definitely hasn't recovered to the level where he can be involved in such matters. The hidden sage is very mysterious, making it difficult to guess his thoughts, but he should know that I am hostile towards him. At this point in the analysis, Klein made a conclusion. Allies: the Evernight Goddess, Lord of Storms, Eternal Blazing Sun, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. Foes: Visionary Adam, True Creator, and Mr. Error Amon. Neutral with tendencies to support me: Earth Mother, Dark Side of the Universe, and Chained God. Neutral with tendencies to support Amon: Hidden Sage. Neutral and ambiguous attitudes: Primordial Demoness, God of Steam and Machinery. Yes, I'll ignore how far Adam and the True Creator have fused. I'll consider the worst-case scenario. I'll treat them as the ancient sun god and treat them as a dual pathway sequence 0 true god. The goddess has the uniqueness of the Twilight Giant and Death. Although she hasn't accommodated them, she has some level of control of them using that bird-shaped, golden accessory as a medium. Even if she can't compare to the ancient sun god, she can definitely stall him. I'll also consider Amon as a dual pathways sequence 0 true god. At least 2 of the Lord of Storms trio have to be diverted to have a chance to fend him off. From the surface, I still hold a certain advantage. Klein looked at the content listed on the piece of paper as he thought silently. However, this advantage didn't consider the neutral factions. Klein tapped the edge of the long-modeled table and considered the worst situation. The Primordial Demoness, Hidden Sage, and God of Steam and Machinery might all choose to help Amon based on their own secret dealings or their morality. This way, even if Earth Mother participated in the battle, Klein's side would be at a disadvantage. The God of Steam and Machinery and the other god from the omnipotent and omniscient pathway would cancel out each other. The Primordial Demoness would hold back the Earth Mother, who had just taken back the uniqueness of the moon. The Hidden Sage would face the universe's dark side and the Chained God, which were controlled by the Mother Tree of Desire. The powers that the outer deities could sneak into the world were extremely limited. This gave the Hidden Sage a likely advantage. Furthermore, this cancellation was a calculation based on ideal conditions. In reality, under the chaotic situation, Amon, who was in charge of the Error Authority, could play many tricks. It was possible that he would be able to find weaknesses in an instant and bypass the obstacles, causing Klein's ritual to fail and make him lose control on the spot. In addition, some deities who supported Klein on the surface might turn to help Amon due to reasons he wasn't aware of. As for the sealed artifacts that could change the power balance between the deities, Klein didn't know much about them and wasn't able to make an analysis. I didn't expect that there would be a day when I fleeced the Mother Tree of Desire. Yes, I have to make some preparations for the worst-case scenario to prevent things from developing in this direction. Klein dispersed the paper and fountain pen in front of him and cast his gaze at a particular prayer light. His figure vanished from Sapphira Castle and appeared on Bernadette's dawn. 1372 The other use of the magic wishing lamp. Queen Mystic Bernadette seemed to have a sense of foreboding when she saw Gehrman Sparrow's arrival. Without any surprise, she put down the ancient scroll in her hand and cast her gaze at the visitor at the door. Klein didn't stand on ceremony and said directly, "I wish to borrow the magic wishing lamp for a day." Bernadette nodded gently and raised her hand to pick up the magic wishing lamp beside her. Her invisible servant immediately held the unique lamp and brought it to Klein. Klein took it and said in a deep voice, "Thank you." Bernadette didn't make any requests. It was as though she wasn't afraid that she would end up having accumulated an additional wish and dying a strange death. She believed that Mr. Fool would be able to resolve this problem because the existence had displayed this ability the last time. In the next second, Klein, who had transformed into Gehrman Sparrow, vanished from the dawn and returned to Sapphira Castle. When he placed the magic wishing lamp on the table in front of him, he immediately saw the candlewick light up, emitting a sticky light that formed a distorted, blurry golden figure. "You haven't fulfilled your promise yet, so I won't fulfill your wishes according to your will again," Genie said with a majestic and dignified voice. "You should know that the current owner of this lamp is Roselle's daughter. The first wish you made was to place her accumulated wishes that could allow her to suffer a backlash at the level above the sequences on you. And this time, I won't permit you to transfer her wishes onto yourself." When Klein had used the magic wishing lamp to escape, he hadn't changed the ownership of this Grade 0 sealed artifact. It still belonged to Bernadette, and its wielder was still Queen Mystic. Therefore, his wish would simultaneously be accumulated on himself and Bernadette. At that time, his first wish was to transfer the 2 wishes that Bernadette had previously made under his name. This cleared Bernadette's accumulated wishes, and he was burdened with 2 wishes. But at the same time, this first wish was also accumulated. Therefore, after it was fulfilled, Bernadette's count became 1, and Klein's was 3. Following that, Klein made a second wish. It would undoubtedly be counted towards both Bernadette and him. Finally, Bernadette's wish count was 2 without exceeding the critical point, while Klein reached 4. Without any surprises, he encountered the backlash from the rules that were at the level of an outer deity. He died on the spot in Adam's Corpse Cathedral and successfully escaped. Under the premise that Klein made another wish, it would make Bernadette's wish count reach 3, causing her to unavoidably suffer something terrifying. Of course, he could also mimic the first wish he did previously, transferring Bernadette's wish count onto himself and spending 1 chance at revival. However, the genie had already made it clear that he would distort any similar wishes, allowing the wish to be realized in a way that Klein didn't wish to see. Sigh, it's also because I was in a rush the last time. And Roselle was affected by the primordial moon, so the wish we came up with was definitely flawed. At that time, I should have added a description to make the first wish only count under my name. Or perhaps, I should have added another wish between the first and second wish to transfer the ownership of the magic wishing lamp to me. After all, my death would result in the ownership being cleared, and the magic wishing lamp would return to its wielder. As Klein sighed inwardly, he smiled at Genie. You should be no stranger to tampering and reassembly. With your level and current state as this lamp, I can now rely on Sapphira Castle to graft its ownership from Bernadette onto me. Or perhaps, we can use a different method and directly use theft? Genie's blurry golden figure fell silent. After a few seconds he said, although you aren't as cunning as him, you're just as shameless. However, this is of no use. After you accumulate your wishes and die, the ownership of this lamp will still return to Roselle's daughter. And I will distort the rules and place your wish count onto her. Also, I said earlier that before you fulfill your promise, I won't fulfill your wish normally again. Klein maintained his smile. I once heard a story regarding investors. When a company is in trouble, the ones who are more willing to provide aid will definitely be the original investors. Although they have already paid a lot, if they don't continue investing, they might not be able to recoup their investment and end up losing all their money. Of course, if they could use other means to retrieve their own share, or exchange their investment for greater benefits, it would be another story. Which type do you think you are? Genie stared at Klein, who was sitting in the fool's seat, and laughed. After you gain a deeper grasp of Sapphira Castle, you also seem to have obtained the eloquence of a swindler. However, unless you help me remove the seal now, it will be difficult for me to affect matters at the level of Sequence 0. At most, you will encounter a backlash from above the sequence's laws and die again. However, this won't be of any help to what you wish to do now. Death means failure. Furthermore, you should know very well that losing control during your advancement will affect all your avatars. It's not something that can be avoided by cutting off all connections. Klein smiled and nodded. Indeed, I haven't thought of a wish yet. I'm just making preparations. With that said, he looked at the magic wishing lamp. Actually, this lamp has another use that can affect matters at Sequence 0. I heard that a true god once attempted to destroy this lamp, but failed in the end. Indeed, how can a lamp that can seal an outer deity be so easily damaged? It definitely has the power of the Lord of the Mysteries or Sapphira Castle. As he spoke, the smile on Klein's face gradually became obvious. It's such a waste not to use something as sturdy as this as a shield. Genie fell silent for a long time. After such a friendly exchange, Klein and Genie exchanged their views. The fact that both of them were connected by fate had allowed them to come up with a preliminary agreement. Then, Klein placed the magic wishing lamp into his pocket, prepared to use it at any time. After completing all of this, he cast his gaze at the fragments of light related to the Hornacis mountain range in the fog of history. He was almost done with his preparations. Next, he would create another avatar and steal the undigested attendant of mysteries beyond or characteristic from himself. Then, he could face the ancestor of the Antigonus family. And this might very well trigger a divine battle. To be frank, Klein didn't wish for that to happen. This was because a war of deities would likely have a negative impact on the real world. Back when the Rose Redemption stopped the resurrection of the Primordial One, in the divine battle to assassinate the ancient sun god, which involved the help of Dark Angel Sasra, it directly brought about a disaster that affected the entire eastern continent. This caused more than 99% of the living creatures there to die, making large swaths of the terrain to resemble the abyss. The War of the Four Emperors and the Pale Disaster had nearly destroyed the northern continent, causing countless people to die and mutate. This caused the mountains to turn into lakes, valleys into peaks, rivers changing paths, the land to collapse, and the ocean to go berserk. The battle between the Evernight goddess and the god of combat happened in the astral world. It happened in the Evernight goddess's divine kingdom, and it was relatively brief. Therefore it had the least impact on the real world. However, before that, the world war that exceeded a year had drained the blood and tears of countless people. If it was possible, Klein was actually willing to give up on Sapphira Castle and live on as a Sequence 1 or even a Sequence 2 angel. The matter would then develop in the most peaceful way. However, along the way, there were already too many existences who provided him with kindness, help, and faith. At this moment, if Klein were to give up, he would put them into danger. This wasn't being kind, but selfish. From time immemorial, which successful person didn't bear the fates of many people? If he gave up, what about the rest? The members of the Tarot Club, the Fool Believers of the City of Silver and Moon City, Azek Eggers, Rionette Tynker, Willa Septon. Various faces quickly flashed across Klein's mind. Finally, he let out a long sigh. If Amon could be trusted, it wasn't that Klein couldn't hand over all of this to him. However, this god of deceit had always been reckless. Even his believers were all himself. If Klein were to give up just like that, notwithstanding his own safety, the people or demigods he had just thought of might be caught by his enemies or directly end up wearing a monocle on their right eye. Among them, Willa Septon and the Fool's believers were in the most danger. Believe in the might of deities, but do not trust their benevolence. This was Klein's decision. When facing the Evernight goddess, he had used the Lord of Storms and company as an example. This was telling her that he wouldn't let her down after all the help she had given. This was the existence that had bet the most on him. If Klein were to give up, the Evernight goddess might have to pay a greater price to obtain the River of Eternal Darkness. She might even not be able to obtain it forever. This was because after the appearance of the two pillars, Lord of the Mysteries and God Almighty, it meant that the threat from the outer deities would be reduced to its lowest level. There wouldn't be any need for additional great old ones to appear. Phew, I'll later use Sapphira Castle to graft the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range to the astral world. This can prevent the war of deities from bringing any harm to the real world to the greatest extent. It can also allow the deities who are guarding the cracking barrier to unleash their full strength. After all, most of my supporters are orthodox deities. Klein's mind raced as he came up with a solution. He then snapped his fingers and used Sapphira Castle to create an avatar to stand beside him. Chapter 1373. Facing the avatar Klein created was a blueprint of his present state, and not Dwayne Dantes, Sherlock Moriarty, or Merlin Hermes, so as to avoid any obstacles in his self-awareness. After experiencing the mutation brought by Adam, he became more careful in such aspects. Glancing at his avatar, Klein's thoughts made his face turn blank. The avatar extended its right hand and stirred Sapphira Castle's strength to grab at the main body. Again and again, it failed more than 10 times. Finally, it managed to extract bits of dark light from the main body. Finally, Klein sighed and extinguished the thought of trying to execute this attempt during the actual battle. Despite not resisting at all, with his body and mind at ease, his avatar had still spent so much time failing while using Sapphira Castle's level and strength. It was easy to imagine its value in actual combat. As more and more Beyonder characteristics left his body, Klein felt relaxed. He felt like he had finally abandoned a heavy burden after a long walk. Of course, there was a certain fluctuation in his mental state. After losing the lingering mental imprint from Zeratul, the awakening of the celestial worthy's consciousness began to invade his mind. This was within Klein's expectations. Therefore, he wasn't flustered at all. With his self-awareness that had long stabilized, his tenacious willpower, and his ample anchors, he gradually resisted the corruption of the celestial worthy's will and found a new balance. At the same time, when the attendant of mysteries Beyonder characteristic that Klein hadn't fully digested entered his avatar's body, its blank face suddenly twisted, growing out dark, lusterless eyes, and an indistinct white long beard. At this moment, it greatly resembled Zeratul. However, it was unable to withstand the madness brought about by the attendant of mysteries Beyonder characteristic. Its body rapidly developed towards collapse as transparent. Distorted maggots crawled out and slippery and sinister tentacles extended out. It lost control on the spot. Klein didn't stay idle. Without any hesitation, he moved his finger, making the avatar turn into his marionette. This terminated the process of losing control. At this point, he had already made all preparations. His main body had completely digested the potion, allowing him to be in a state to accommodate the fool's uniqueness. He also had a sequence 1 marionette. Following that, Klein leaned back into his chair and replayed what he was about to do in his mind to see if there were any fatal flaws. This is the most I can do for the battle of the deities. I can only do my best afterwards. Am I being too optimistic about the first stage because of the goddess's help and the supplementary river of eternal darkness's water? That's why I'm not worried that the Antigonus family's ancestor won't cause any accidents. After a round of scrutiny, Klein felt that he was still not cautious enough. There was a little arrogance and carelessness in the matter. After some thought, he created another avatar which still had a blank face. After completing this, Klein stood up, took out Creeping Hunger from the fog of history, and wore it on his left hand. This was a preparation for any possible small-scale battles. Under such a scene, Blink was faster and more convenient than grafting. After adjusting his collar, Klein slowly surveyed the area and made his gaze fall on the strange door of light that was stained with bluish-black. It landed on the humans who were hanging there, wrapped in transparent cocoons. As he scanned each and every one of them, his gaze landed on the 3 shattered transparent cocoons. In the next second, Klein's figure vanished and appeared in the grayish-white fog of history. He walked to the time before the first epoch, and he arrived at the stacked metropolis of old. He stood at the top of a dilapidated skyscraper that barely stood erect. He looked down at the pile of wreckage, the public transportation vehicles that had turned into metal pancakes, and numerous overlapping sedans. Amidst the silence, he swept his gaze across the remaining buildings. It seemed to pass through the barriers of history, allowing him to see the electric lamps lit up inside them. The light from the lamps spread out gently, illuminating the glass and skyscrapers, streets, and every corner of Metropolis ruins. After staring at it for a long time, Klein retracted his gaze and took a step back to the real world. Right on the heels of that, he directly teleported to the summit of the Hornacis mountain range. He saw that ancient palace that was shrouded in fog, dilapidated, and overgrown with weeds. His marionette and avatar appeared in front of him, like 2 guards. Facing the ancient palace, Klein pressed his top hat, raised his right hand, and snapped his fingers. The peak of the Hornacis mountain range instantly turned dark. Illusory stars appeared around them. Klein had grafted this place to the astral world. Without any hesitation, he led his marionette and avatar to the main door of the ancient palace. The marionette that looked almost identical to him was 1 step ahead. It bent down, stretched out its hands, and slowly pushed the heavy stone door open. The door slowly creaked open, revealing the scene inside. And it was different from the last time Klein sent the Trunsoist brass book over. It was dark inside, making it impossible for anyone to see the numerous corpses hanging above the hall, nor could he see the cluster of transparent maggots that were sitting on the huge stone chair. Without needing to guess, Klein made use of the intuition of a seer at the King of Angels level to confirm that this was the change caused by the Evernight goddess using the river of eternal darkness's water to allow the ancestor of the Antigonus family to enter a state of eternal slumber. After the marionette and avatar entered, he slowly walked through the door and entered the palace. The darkness swayed and changed. Numerous buildings appeared in the surroundings as figures walked along the streets. Their voices spread out, causing the surroundings to become lively and noisy. The people ignored Klein and his marionette and avatar as they headed for their destinations while chatting with each other. They and the buildings were dark in color, almost close to black and white. They were like old photos that came from deep within history that had suddenly come to life. This made Klein think of black and white holographic projections, the scenes in the historical void, and those in real dreams. He strolled through this town and walked along the elevating streets. And the higher they went, the more magnificent the buildings became. The massive stone pillar supported an exaggerated dome. The people living in this black and white photo were generally tall. They seemed to be learning, working, and resting. The scenes here changed continuously, showing the birth of a baby, the growth of a child, the ignorance of youth, the worries of an adult, the pressure of a middle-aged man, and the sorrow of aging. Of course, they were all interlinked with each other. Only a portion would become the main theme at times. As Klein ventured deeper, he saw the residents of the towns die. Their loved ones weren't overly sad. They carried the dead back home, placed them on the bed with a pillow as if the corpses were still alive. When Klein was about to leave the town's borders, the dead got up from bed, left their family, and walked out of their homes, heading towards the highest point of the street. There was also a city there. It seemed to be the city of the dead, the eventual refuge of life, a kingdom of eternal repose. This was very close to where normal people lived. The latter was distributed by the mountainside to the peak, while the former was on the peak. Others might be surprised by such a state, but Klein instantly understood what this scenery meant. This was because he directly saw spirit body threads on the deceased. The moment they were about to die, their spirit body threads floated towards the peak, controlled by an unknown existence. That also meant that they had become marionettes. Therefore, the deceased could leave their own families and head to the peak after dying for some time. And this was completely in line with the details mentioned in the research of the Hornacis main peak's relics. The nation of the Evernight belonged to the Mother of the Sky from the Evernight pathway, but at the peak, there was a town used by the Antigonus family's ancestor. Therefore, the residents of the nation of the Evernight were respectful and afraid of Evernight. They believed in the Mother of the Sky. At the same time, they believed that death was not the end. They believed that their dead loved ones would bless them from Evernight. Indeed, death wasn't the end. The city of dead was just beside them, at the peak. They could reach it just by walking, and the dead would continue living their lives as marionettes. In the eyes of ordinary people, this was undoubtedly the same as still being alive. The nation of the living and the city of dead were like two ends of a road. The distance between life and death was so close that they were like neighbors. This also explained why the nation of the Evernight didn't have tombs, as the deceased didn't need to be buried. They turned into marionettes and headed for the peak. This should be the nation of the Evernight from back then. Klein nodded slightly and proceeded towards the peak in the dark environment. What entered his eyes was indeed a seemingly normal town, but everyone here was a marionette. After passing through the marionettes who dressed and looked different, Klein entered the magnificent palace that seemed to honor a deity. Deep in the palace, on the huge stone chair, a figure propped its elbow on the armrest, its head leaning back against the chair. His face was rather young, but his long hair was half white. Half of it was concealed, the other revealed. His appearance was that of a man, and his eyes were darker than Zeratil's, and they contained an indescribable sense of the vicissitudes of life. His facial features were pretty good, but his cheeks had a thick black tuft of fur that resembled a wolf fur. He gave off a feeling of both old age and youthfulness, rationality and madness. This was the ancestor of the Antigonus family. This time he didn't appear in the form of a mythical creature, and instead sat on a huge stone chair in his original appearance. At that moment, his eyes were tightly shut as though he was in a deep sleep. And inside the hall, there were corpses wearing simple or luxurious clothes hanging from the ceiling. They were like inverted forests that swayed gently in the wind. After entering a state of eternal slumber, the ancestor of the Antigonus family finally managed to temporarily free himself from the state of losing control and madness, and return to how he was before. Klein stood in the middle of the hall, looking at his target as he sighed. The scene he saw of the nation of the Evernight and the city of dead earlier was the dream belonging to Antigonus, a dream that lasted for more than 1,000 years. Chapter 1374 Trojan Horse of Destiny. Looking at the half-fool on the huge stone chair, the scenes from before, as well as the relevant scenes of the nation of the Evernight flashed through Klein's mind. This evoked thoughts in him. He didn't know much about Antigonus. In fact, he had almost lost control because of the ravings of his Hornacis. Phlegria, therefore, he didn't feel any sympathy at the moment, at best some form of empathy. The lingering memories were undoubtedly one of the best memories of the past. Even though he was born extraordinary, Antigonus seemed to be deeply fond of the small, peaceful, and isolated nation. Klein slowly exhaled as he looked away from the man with the thick, black, sharp beard, and his gaze landed on the huge stone chair to the side. A book made of thin yellow brass was quietly placed there. It kept having 3 mercury-colored lines of rules being superseded on it. 0-02. Trunsoist Brass Book. Using powers similar to grafting to complete the seal? Yes, it seems to have gone a step further. Not only is the beginning directly connected to the end, but the intelligence of the Trunsoist Brass Book has also been fooled, allowing it to ignore the middle parts that had been skipped, and not making attempts to change things. It just keeps repeating actions over and over again. Klein glanced at 0-02 and muttered to himself in thought. This made him have some guesses about the abilities of the fool. Without thinking further, Klein got the attendant of Mystery's marionette to graft, the starting point to the end point as he walked to the huge stone chair and picked up the trunsoist brass book. On the one hand, this was to eliminate any possible interference, and on the other hand, he was trying to test out Antigonus's current condition. Seeing that the half-fool was still sleeping and unable to escape from his eternal slumber, Klein heaved a sigh of relief. He made his marionette take the trunsoist brass book and retreat to the entrance of the palace to wait for him. The reason he didn't allow his avatar to retrieve the Grade 0 sealed artifact was that he was worried that the trunsoist brass book, which had a certain connection with a sapphira, would be able to produce passive negative effects during the critical moment he was accommodating the fool's uniqueness. This might lead to the situation developing in a terrible direction. When it came to avoiding the negative effects of the sealed artifact, marionettes were definitely better than avatars. This was also why Klein didn't bring the Staff of the Stars. He couldn't place a time bomb beside him. Usually it was fine. He could rely on his level, status, and abilities so as to forcefully suppress the Staff of the Stars, but in the process of accommodating the fool's uniqueness, he would be very weak. He couldn't interfere with the people or things around him. Any mistakes could cause him to lose control on the spot. To deal with the situation of Sapphira Castle being sealed, thus causing him to be unable to use its powers, Klein had no choice but to bring a sealed artifact that could provide teleportation powers. Therefore, he chose Creeping Hunger. At that moment, Klein felt the glove on his left hand tremble while facing a king of angels that controlled a uniqueness. He then used his right hand to caress Creeping Hunger and whispered jokingly, "Don't worry. You're just a projection from the historical void." Using this method to ease his taut nerves, Klein surveyed the area and confirmed that there was nothing else he needed to do. Immediately after, he placed his hand on his chest and bowed deeply to Antigonus. When he straightened his body and lifted his head, a complicated, mysterious, illusory brand appeared on his forehead. This brand was like a strange door of light that was tainted with hints of bluish-black. It constantly emitted a faint grayish-white fog. In the next second, Klein reached out his right hand. Although it wasn't too far away, not was it too close. He contained Antigonus's body within his fingers. His fingers quickly closed, and with a twist of his wrist, he completed the theft. He obtained nothing. This attempt failed. Klein wasn't depressed. He once again began stealing Antigonus's identity, fate, and self-awareness. Although he was already a king of angels, his powers in stealing came from Sapphira Castle. At present, he was only at Sequence 1, while Antigonus had been corrupted by the Lord of the Mysteries, a king of angels that had accommodated the uniqueness. There was still an obvious difference between the two. Therefore, even if Antigonus had entered a temporary state of eternal slumber and was unable to resist, Klein suffered failure many times. He wasn't nervous or disappointed in such a situation. This was something he had expected previously. After all, as long as the theft wasn't completed, the Evernight goddess wouldn't dispel the concealment effect and let the fate here interact with the real world. There wouldn't be any external interference either. Klein had plenty of time and a stable environment to continue his attempts. After failing countless times, Klein suddenly had a flash of inspiration and predicted something. He reached out his right hand again, closed his fingers, and twisted them gently. Suddenly, he felt something invisible leave Antigonus's body and float towards him. At the same time, an indescribable river of light with countless distributaries appeared in front of him. The illusory river continued to flow forward, drowning one distributary after another, allowing them to become part of the main river. This was a symbol of fate. It also had many different images, such as a slowly rotating segmented wheel, or a giant serpent that had its head and tail connected. At that moment, when fate was swapped, Klein saw the river of light. In the next second, fragmented images and scenes appeared in Klein's mind. An 8-legged demonic wolf, who had just been born, was sprawled on the hill. Amidst the thick and black short fur on its body, transparent and distorted maggots crawled about. He was the youngest son of the ancient god, Phlegria, a natural mythical creature. At that moment, he was looking at his sister, brother, and a portion of his clansmen playing amongst corpses. He despised the crude methods they employed when dealing with their prey. He believed that prey should be hoisted up for slow, refined enjoyment to match their status. This demonic wolf that could be called a subsidiary god was most afraid of his father, the powerful, terrifying, crazy ancient god. Although Phlegria had already produced many children through instinctual mating, removing plenty of his beyonder characteristics, it was uncontrollable with no way to guarantee progress. Therefore he was still crazy, cruel, bloodthirsty, and filled with an instinct for destruction. He had even killed several descendants. This demonic wolf who could create miracles and fulfill all kinds of wishes chased after his prey, biting or killing them, thus enjoying a state of pure happiness. He didn't have a deep impression of the subsidiary gods of his father, Phlegria. He clearly remembered that he hated the god of wishes, Kotor, even if he was also a demonic wolf. Also, he didn't like the god of death, Salinger. He found him gloomy, solitary, and that he exuded a rotting and disgusting aura. On the other hand, goddess of misfortune, Ammonizes, met the beauty standards of both a demonic wolf and a human. She had a gentle personality and was very good at placating one's heart. She wasn't annoying, but this female subsidiary goddess rarely appeared. She was always like a shadow, hiding in a place that wasn't easily discovered. Of course, the demonic wolf remembered that a few of his older sisters and brothers were rather against Ammonizes, hoping to seize her position. The demonic wolf witnessed his father's death, the death of a powerful ancient god, and saw the blood of the ancient god splattered all over the body of the goddess of misfortune, Ammonizes. And in the chaos, the uniqueness and a sequence one beyond her characteristic were pulled into her hands. He and one of his sisters escaped the kingdom of the demonic wolves and hid everywhere. Without the protection of his father, the demonic wolf and his sister realized that their former reckless life wasn't normal. Pain and danger were present in everything. Finally, they crossed the sea and came to the northern continent. They established a concealed kingdom in the uninhabited Hornacis mountain range. He and his sister didn't dare expose themselves. All they did was gather believers and amass a population. In this situation, he created the city of dead that existed alongside a living nation, making the dead believers become his marionettes to complete an advancement ritual. Although this period was filled with anxiety, it was the best time period in the memories of this demonic wolf. As he saw his sister having more and more believers, and how his marionette town was becoming more complete, he seemed to have forgotten the troubles and dangers of the outside world and achieved the first peaceful time period since his birth. Under the influence of the believers, he and his sister gradually gained some so-called humanity. After the cataclysm, he finally advanced to attendant of mysteries and turned himself into a human. With the last name of Antigonus, he left the Hornacis mountain range and returned to the real world outside the concealed kingdom. From this moment onwards, Antigonus's memories and knowledge became increasingly fragmented. Many times he even found himself a little unfamiliar. After he accommodated the fool's uniqueness, the situation became worse. As the images flashed, Klein quickly came to a realization. I am Antigonus. I am the half-fool. With a loud boom, his body constantly changed. At times, he had black hair, brown eyes, and a scholarly air, a Klein Moretti who had fused with Zhou Mingrue's appearance. Occasionally, he had long white hair and a thick black beard like Antigonus. Other times, he wore a dark black cloak that made it difficult to see his face, and this mysterious person constantly extended slippery tentacles to the side. At that moment, Klein's thoughts were extremely chaotic. His mental state was completely imbalanced. He was barely able to maintain his self-awareness. Under the impact of the two mental storms, he teetered. At the same time, he had received the fate of Antigonus's losing control and was on the verge of collapse. A series of prayers rang out in his ears. Each and every word of praise was mixed together, forming an illusory image that joined the chaotic battlefield. Rorsted Archipelago, Biome, the bell tower of the Church of the Fool. A young man wearing a pointed hat and monocle suddenly appeared here and stood behind the railing, looking down at the entire city. Mr. Araramon. In the next second, he saw Biome and the distant new city of Silver and New Moon City disappear as though someone had wiped them off the map with an eraser. How boring. Upon seeing this scene, Amon shook his head with a smile. He wasn't disappointed either. He only wanted to test if Klein or the Evernight goddess had repaired the bug in this aspect. After striking the bell, he could be considered the fool's angel of time to a certain extent. He could use this loophole to directly steal a portion of his anchors. Such theft was of little value, but it was very useful at the critical moment of a ritual. The sudden decrease in anchors would definitely tip the balance, causing Klein to lose control on the spot. Amon then retracted his gaze and raised his hand to straighten the monocle on his right eye. It was as if the light from the stars suddenly lit up in the crystal monocle. Chapter 1375 Beginning the Accommodation Thud. Thud. The doors of Backlund, Trier, Lenberg, and St. Millem opened and closed at the same time without a breeze. Inside a white tower in the headquarters of the god of knowledge and wisdom, Luca, who was on duty underground, sensed that something was amiss and stood up abruptly. As a prophet, he acutely sensed that something was happening. The elder in a brass-threaded white robe immediately used a mystical technique and arrived at the entrance of the underground area. He pushed the door open. However, the door that wasn't considered heavy to a demigod didn't budge as though it was sealed by an invisible force. Luca Brewster didn't attempt to forcibly open it as he cast his gaze deep underground. There was silence. There was no sound. This isn't normal. Luca didn't need to rely on his beyonder powers to determine the problem here. Usually, in the deepest part of the ground, there would always be sounds that made people's hair stand on end. But now, it was as if it had disappeared, as though it never existed. Others might not know, but as a high-ranking member of the Church of Knowledge, Luca knew that the voice came from an extremely terrifying sealed artifact that even he didn't know the exact details of, so it was impossible for it to be erased out of thin air. The current situation could only mean one thing. Either the sealed artifact had already escaped the restrictions and entered a more bizarre state, or it had been sealed further, preventing it from affecting the outside world. Regardless of the possibility, it meant that there was extreme danger lurking in the surroundings. This was because the sealed artifact's number was 0-01. At the top of Byam's remaining bell tower, the light on Amon's monocle gradually faded, returning to normal. Mr. Error hadn't held back from showcasing his new beyonder powers, doing so to make a statement to all the existences watching him. He had already accommodated Door's uniqueness and obtained the corresponding authority. He had used this opportunity to shut off everything related to the concept of a door in the entire world, greatly strengthening the effects of any seals. This caused the Orthodox churches and secret organizations to be unable to use sealed items for a short period of time, because no one could remove the seal. Even if a true deity descended from the astral world, it would still take them a certain amount of time before they could break the restrictions. Therefore, Amon eliminated most Grade 0 sealed artifacts in the subsequent Battle of Gods. He no longer needed to consider the corresponding interference. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU. Of course, such authority wouldn't be able to influence the entire world for too long unless Mr. Error had put all his energy into this matter. It was precisely because of this that he didn't do it ahead of time. Only when he observed the disturbance in Klein's anchors did he suddenly act. The more powerful a Grade 0 sealed artifact was, the more terrifying the negative effects would be. It was even more so for those that could produce effects at the level of a deity. Even a Sequence 0 true deity might not be able to withstand it for too long. Therefore, true deities wouldn't unseal them unless it was necessary. Otherwise, this would bring about an even greater disturbance to them, causing them to suffer a net loss. After doing this, Amon held up his palm and gently leaped up. Without the bearing of a true god, Heap sat on the railing at the top of the bell tower. As he gazed at the horizon out into the sea, Heap leisurely waited for the concealment to be removed. That was when Klein's ritual to accommodate the fool's uniqueness officially began. When that happened, he would strike the death knell for him. In the concealed world of the Evernight goddess, under the repeated impact of the awakening of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, and Antigonus's self-awareness and mental imprint, Klein's consciousness was like a sailboat in a storm. It would sometimes be thrown high while being struck down. At times, it would suffer corrosion, and at other times be slammed to the side. This made his thoughts turn extremely chaotic. He was about to split into two different personalities, known as Antigonus and the Lord of the Mysteries. At the same time, his avatar also lost its rationality. It was in a state of being about to collapse into a whirlpool of maggots. Only the marionette remained standing there in a daze due to the lack of any control. The prayers from the believers resounded in Klein's ears, forming a corresponding image of what he knew. This was like a dam that was resisting a surging flood. Klein wasn't too unfamiliar with such a situation. He had a similar experience after becoming an attendant of mysteries and swallowing Zeratl's beyonder characteristic. Therefore, with the help of his anchors, he managed to survive the initial chaos. With great familiarity, he directed the self-awareness and mental imprint of Antigonus towards the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. This caused both parties to corrode each other and be occupied with each other. The mind storm weakened a lot, finally giving Klein's self-consciousness a breather. Before he could calm down, he immediately directed the image of him as a god formed by many anchors, into the two mental corruptions struggle and tried to find a new balance. However, this didn't go smoothly. Compared to before, the essence of Antigonus's mental imprint, resilience, and madness were clearly stronger than Zeratil's. After all, this was a king of angels that had accommodated the uniqueness and was known as the half-fool. Furthermore, Klein had also stolen the other party's identity and fate. This brought about two other negative effects. His personality was constantly on the edge of dissociating. From time to time, he would think that he was Antigonus, attempting to fuse his mental imprint with his own mind. Having accepted the fate of Antigonus's loss of control, his entire body was collapsing uncontrollably. This brought about even more mental corruption. In addition, Antigonus's mental imprint and the awakened will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings wasn't completely incompatible. In some aspects of their battle, they showed signs of fusing together. It was as if they originated from the same existence. This gave Klein preliminary confirmation. As a natural mythical creature, Antigonus was born with some of the celestial worthy's will. When he advanced to Attendant of Mysteries, the problem suddenly became serious, causing him to undergo unexpected changes without him realizing it. By the time he managed to accommodate the fool's uniqueness, madness had apparently become another side of him. In other words, before completely losing control, Antigonus was already a mentally sutured monster to a certain level. His self-awareness and mental imprint were part of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, and this was something that couldn't be separated by using theft. Compared to him, Zeratil's mental imprint was much cleaner. There was only a small portion that belonged to the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. Most of it came from Zeratil's intense emotions at his deathbed. The reason why the two were different was that, apart from the fact that Antigonus had accommodated the fool's uniqueness, the former had become the Attendant of Mysteries at the beginning of the fourth epoch. At that time, the will of the celestial worthy hadn't weakened to the state it was in during the late fifth epoch. Without being able to form a new balance, the speed of Klein's breakdown became faster and faster. More than half of his body was formed from transparent and distorted maggots, and he extended slippery and sinister tentacles into his surroundings. Just as he was trying his best to maintain his consciousness and not give up searching for a new balance, his collapsed body, Antigonus's crazy mental state, and the consciousness of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings all fell into a deep sleep. This caused all the changes to stop abruptly and return to normal. As for Klein's self-consciousness, he used his trait of resisting dreams and the invasion of his mind to maintain his clarity of mind. That's right. The fate that I stole includes the fate of being in a state of eternal slumber outside the fate of going crazy and losing control. As for me, I can resist eternal slumber to a certain extent. Klein grabbed the sliver of clarity and gained a certain understanding of his present state. To him, this was an opportunity. It was only at this moment that he fully understood why the Evernight goddess needed the river water of the river of eternal darkness to use as a medium to attempt this. This wasn't only because it was difficult to put a king of angels who had accommodated the uniqueness and the awakening will of the Lord of the Mysteries in here to temporarily enter a state of eternal sleep, but it was beneficial to Klein for this state of eternal slumber. This could create an excellent environment of him being the only one with a sliver of consciousness while the other interference was all sleeping. At the same time, Klein also confirmed one thing. The reason why he was able to remain clear-headed in a dream and during the instances where his mind was intruded wasn't because of the special traits from Sapphira Castle. This was because the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in his body was also sleeping. Although the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries was still greatly limited, his level and his connection with Sapphira Castle were undoubtedly stronger than Klein's. If he couldn't completely resist a state of eternal slumber, why could Klein? Therefore, Klein believed that this trait was likely due to the blessings of the Evernight goddess, a gift he received when he came to life. The blessings given by a true goddess who wielded the power of the dream domain, and the aura, strength, and magical powers that Sapphira Castle augmented him with had combined together to form such a special trait. It was as if a gentle song came from deep within the dream. Klein's consciousness became clearer. Without any hesitation, he immediately adjusted the sleeping imprint and corruption in his body and found a new balance. Following that, he extended slippery tentacles with strange patterns and used Sapphira Castle's powers to steal the fool's uniqueness inside Antigonus's body. Perhaps it was because he was now Antigonus. The theft this time was successful after small number failures. A translucent mask with the symbol of the fool flew out from Antigonus's body. The man with the thick black beard was still sleeping, as though he would sleep forever. At the same time, the fog dissipated and illusory starlight shone into the hall. This ancient palace suddenly appeared in the dark and mysterious astral world, appearing at the peak of the Hornacis mountain range. The concealment had been removed, and fate began to be exchanged. At this moment in the forsaken land of the gods, on one of the mountain peaks, a shadow-like curtain appeared on the surface of a huge cross. It cracked open and a man walked out from it. He was Adam, dressed in a simple white robe with a thick blonde beard. Behind him was a thick shadow with 5 heads. This shadow had partially merged with him, but it hadn't completely become one. Adam raised his head and looked at the astral world, which had been distorted from authority and symbolism. He smiled calmly and said to the shadow behind him, "They don't seem to be aware of the reason why I used visionary as the foundation this time. I've never told anyone about the results of this research." Just as he said that, he proclaimed in a solemn and deep voice, "I am one, and also infinity, the beginning and the end." His eyes suddenly turned illusory as an ocean that seemed to contain all possible colors that appeared around him. Adam then raised his hand and grabbed the silver cross pendant hanging in front of his chest. A burning but illusory sun suddenly appeared above his head. To his left, lightning, squalls, and waves formed a supercilious phantom. On his right, there was a white tower with numerous brass eyes. The authorities and symbols that Adam had envisioned entered his body one after another under the influence of the chaos sea. Finally, the shadow that clung tightly to Adam's back shrank into his body. Suddenly, the sea that contained all the colors began to rise. Adam expanded into a giant shadow that seemed capable of holding up the world. The shadow slowly walked on the water surface of the illusory, chaotic darkness. It pointed at the astral world and solemnly declared, "Let there be light." In a blink of an eye, the entire astral world lit up. There were no other secrets that could be concealed. Even portions of the astral world that connected to Earth, the entire astral world, and the invisible barrier that had been separated from the universe appeared. At that moment, giant, indescribable faces seemed to cling to the transparent, cracked barrier, silently watching the developments inside. Chapter 1376. Half a great old one inside the astral world, which was even more abstract than the spirit world, looking as though all the authorities and symbolism in the universe were included inside. Every object appeared. And the light that illuminated this area wasn't spread uniformly. It was mainly concentrated in a few places, stacking together, forming spots created by a prism. There were a total of 3 spots in such a state, each sealing the various illusory kingdoms. One of the kingdoms was covered in bright flowers in perpetual daylight. Another seemed to be formed from books that were opened or closed. Different figures shuttled between them as they read as a form of entertainment. One was covered in storms as lightning and thunder continued without end in the boundless ocean. In the next second, the 3 different kingdoms underwent a violent change. In the area with perpetual daylight, all the flowers emitted light, as if they had become burning miniature suns. The countless miniature suns intertwined together and surged deep into the kingdom before rising into an abnormally blinding golden sun. It emitted a scorching light that could illuminate the entire world, an entire solar system. However, no matter how much energy was released by this almost real sun, or how many flares of super high temperature flames it created, it was unable to break through the prism-like spots of light. Every destroyed layer had a new layer produced at an equal speed. In another part of the astral world, on the surface of the mysterious country formed from all kinds of books, bits of brass points of light rapidly circulated on the spot of light, forming mysterious symbols that seemed to be searching for a critical point or effective method to destroy the barrier. During this process, the faint light formed a pair of illusory eyes that directly saw the weak spots and created eyes there. Meanwhile, inside the spot of light, there was also faint light swirling in it. It repeatedly took form, changing the critical points of the structure. This made it seem as though both sides were in a contest of their calculative abilities, with neither side clinching victory. In the boundless sea that was enveloped by lightning, wind, and rain, the spot of light suddenly lit up. It brought a portion of matter and approached the limit to speed, creating a violent wave that could destroy a planet. Such a wave, and the tiny bits of light constantly struck the prism-like spot of light, turning it into countless falling specks of light. At some point in time, the spot of light began to ripple like an illusory ocean that seemed to contain all colors. It seemed to solidify the surrounding environment, causing the light spots that carried the storm to slow down uncontrollably. Then, the points of light repeated a state of acceleration and deceleration. This kept repeating, but they refused to give up. With the Chaos Sea as a source, Adam used himself and the true creator as a pillar, envisioned three uniquenesses, and accommodated them into this system. Adam seemed to exceed the limitations of above the sequences and became half a great old one. He was able to forcefully suppress the eternal blazing sun, the Lord of Storms, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom by himself, trapping the three sequence O true gods within their respective divine kingdoms. At that moment, he seemed to return to his peak condition, becoming that ancient sun god who slew one ancient god after another. He chose the two pathways of Visionary and the Hanged Man as his foundation for his resurrection because, apart from them having the trait of resurrecting, this was also the result of his research. This had the highest chance of becoming God Almighty. After using either one of the two pathways of Visionary and the Hanged Man to become a true god and gaining initial control over the Chaos Sea, he could take back the remaining uniquenesses and sequence one beyonder characteristics. This was the easiest path to advance to the Lord of the Astral World. And in this matter, there was something more special about Visionary than the Hanged Man. When the Visionary first gained control of the Chaos Sea and accommodated a second uniqueness and corresponding sequence one beyonder characteristic to a certain extent, he could envision the remaining, fake symbolism and authority, allowing him to briefly obtain strength that transcended the sequences, giving him half a great old one's strength. However, at the end of the third epoch, the ancient sun god's plan was, after being assassinated, he would immediately revive in the giant king's court where Sasra was. He would first take back the Hanged Man's uniqueness and three sequence one beyonder characteristics and became a sequence O true god. Then, with the first blasphemy slate placed beside him, he would gain preliminary control over the Chaos Sea. With this foundation, he would allow Angel of Imagination Adam to awaken and return to his main body to form a support. After building such a system, the ancient sun god would make use of the Hanged Man's grazing ability and a Visionary's virtual persona means to control the uniquenesses and sequence one beyonder characteristics of the sun, reader, and sailor pathways to allow himself to become infinitely close to a great old one and to maintain a minimum level of stability. He didn't directly accommodate the Chaos Sea and the other three pathways' uniqueness and sequence one beyonder characteristics, because he didn't want to advance to become a great old one, a pillar in that era. That would inevitably lead to the resurrection of God Almighty, causing him to lose himself. He planned on controlling the situation and materials. When the apocalypse approached, he would finish the last few steps and become a pillar with self-consciousness. And back then, he didn't plan on using Visionary as a foundation because he hadn't obtained the Quill of Alzahad. He lacked the main ingredient. When the kings of angels betrayed him and the plan failed miserably, he decided to take advantage of the disaster to take the best path when he was revived in Adam. At this moment, Adam, who had transformed into a giant shadow, stood on the water surface of the illusory, chaotic darkness, reflecting the astral world into his eyes, making it difficult for the three true gods to break through the restrictions. Surrounding him were beams of light that constantly fell from high above with blazing tails, illuminating the entire forsaken land of the gods, making both the northern and southern continents experience midday conditions simultaneously. In Biam's remaining bell tower, Amon, who was sitting on the railing, nudged the crystal monocle. With both hands propped up, he suddenly leaped up and entered the astral world. During this process, his left hand had an ancient mottled stone slab appear at some point in time. The first blasphemy slate. Amon had once used it to seal the gap caused by Mr. Door's returning ritual, to prevent the invasion of the Mother Goddess of Depravity. After the return ritual ended, and the door of flesh and blood completely collapsed without a tunnel to maintain anymore, he retrieved the blasphemy slate. At that moment, Amon casually threw the ancient mottled stone slate down from the astral world and allowed it to land somewhere in the fog sea. It was a mountain that tore out of the boundless black fog. There was no end to its depth. Its surroundings appeared like a continent. After the first blasphemy slate landed, it accurately stabbed into the peak of the mountain, forming an illusory sea that contained all the colors. At the same time, Amon entered the astral world and saw the main peak of the Hornaces mountain range that had been grafted here. He saw the ancient and dilapidated palace on the mountain peak. Wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, his body rapidly expanded, instantly reaching the scale of a mountain. He opened his mouth as though he was about to swallow Antigonus's magnificent but dilapidated palace. Suddenly, he saw a blurry figure. This figure was wearing a long layered black dress that was not complicated but had countless stars speckled on it. She was as big as the current Amon. A pair of huge arms covered in dark black short hair grew out from both her torso and waist, but there was a beautiful and gentle face that was covered in thin black gauze. Her eyes seemed to compress the starry night sky. It made one feel at peace, but it also made one feel an uncontrollable fear. One of her 2 hands held a huge scythe, and another pair held a bird-shaped, golden accessory. The remaining pair held nothing, as though she was holding an invisible object. Evernight Goddess. In the next second, Amon, who was wearing a monocle on his right eye, was quickly wiped away by an eraser like he was a sketch. The Evernight Goddess raised her 2 empty arms as she held up an almost invisible fog. On the surface of the fog, multiple doors of different shapes rapidly opened in different spots, but they were instantly blocked, preventing any loopholes from taking place. The Evernight Goddess floated above the peak of the Hornacis mountain range in the astral world as she focused on controlling the fog world in her hand, preventing Amon's true body from escaping. As more and more doors appeared, the opening of doors became faster and faster. This goddess was unable to deal with it alone. All she could do was raise her other 2 arms and raise the huge scythe. The dark black scythe rapidly turned into a corporeal coffin made of black fog. The almost invisible fog world was stuffed into the coffin, and all the movements instantly ceased. It was as though death had occurred. However, this silence only lasted for a second. On the surface of the black fog-formed coffin, a series of doors took form and opened again. As the Evernight Goddess sealed the doors, she raised her arm that held a bird-shaped, golden accessory. The orange glow of twilight fell, adding a sense of decay and extinction to the heavy black coffin. The formation and opening of the doors slowed down as both parties entered a tug-of-war. At that moment, at the foot of the Evernight Goddess, the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range collapsed. It was like the apocalypse had arrived early. At the same time, python-like black tentacles extended out from somewhere in the astral world. There was an eye at the end of each tentacle, either opened or closed. Any object that was seen by them would instantly turn into grayish-white rock, and anything touched by the tentacles distorted as limbs and heads stretched out, turning into good-looking women of all sizes. As the grayish-white spread rapidly, the tentacles surged towards the ancient and dilapidated palace, rushing towards Klein, who was about to accommodate the fool's uniqueness. Primordial Demoness Cheek. Chapter 1377. Crazy ravings. Countless demonesses of varying sizes brought with them the destruction of all matter, causing the scene of the entire Hornacis mountain range to develop in the direction of turning into a huge stone sphere. This made the dilapidated walls of the ancient palace collapse rapidly, exposing Klein, who was in the middle of the hall, along with his avatar and marionette, out into the middle of the astral world. Just as the python-like black tentacles were about to rush into the palace, a crimson moon rose up like a scene from the apocalypse. In the perimeter of the hall that was bathed in moonlight, a cluster of wheat instantly grew out. There were flowers, mushrooms, and trees. They intertwined with each other, layer by layer, sealing the palace that belonged to Antigonus. At that moment, the hall where Klein was in seemed to be a ruin that had been sealed in history and a forest for thousands of years, as though it had been swallowed up by nature. The python-like black tentacles with eyes on their tips were blocked by plants growing wildly. They rose up as they constantly struck the screen that originated from nature, causing the latter to collapse or peel under layer after layer of petrification effects. However, no matter whether it was the wheat, flowers, mushrooms, trees, or newborns, they quickly returned to Earth Mother's embrace and grew again. Just like that, the barriers of nature were reborn and destroyed, layer by layer, as layer after layer was reborn. This showdown entered a stalemate. Earth Mother, who controlled the moon's uniqueness, fended off Primordial Demoness Cheek. At this moment, a light that couldn't be seen by most Beyonders landed from high above and crashed into the barrier of nature that used plants as a foundation. The light didn't have a physical body, as though it was formed from a flux of massive and miscellaneous information. In its illusory form, it tore through the gaps between the plants, like a torrent, heading straight for Klein, who was about to retrieve the translucent mask. Hidden Sage. At this moment, a blurry light shot out from the void, revealing picture-like projections around Klein. Some of them recorded the helplessness and misery humans felt when facing supernatural beings. Some of them used an epic-like brush to reenact the scenes of humans using their own bodies as experiments to attempt fusing with Beyonder ingredients to obtain strength and save the race. Some described the unique cultures and traditions due to a Black Emperor, while others carried various viewpoints, books, and inventions. Some resembled the dawn of the present world, starting from the massive machinery that spewed steam, buildings that rose higher and higher, and clothes that made movement easier. The contents made the seemingly thin painting exude a heaviness. This was because they bore the inspiration and development of civilization, of human society at different stages. Back then, the god of craftsmanship didn't properly digest the sequence 1 civilization enlightener potion before advancing to sequence O due to various reasons. He maintained his rationality and lucidity. However, this made him have to focus more on resisting the madness and inclination towards losing control. Amongst the 7 orthodox gods, he was slightly weaker than the other existences. The reason why the Church of Steam was the weakest orthodox organization was that, apart from having the shortest history and the least heritage, its corresponding god was also not in the best of conditions. By the time Roselle raised the Industrial Revolution as the son of Steam, a member of the church, and brought with him all sorts of ideas, the god of craftsmanship took the opportunity to change his name to the god of steam and machinery, sharing in the progress of the enlightenment of civilization, and digested the corresponding potion. As a true god in a neighboring pathway, he eventually chose to stand on the orthodox deity's side after the hidden sage chose to be Klein's enemy. The terrifying flood of information crashed into the illusory pictures and rapidly expanded, attempting to crack the cage. However, the tens of thousands of years of civilizations were thick and vast. The history left behind by generations of humans that numbered hundreds of millions was so vast and magnificent. It was enough to contain the information flux of the hidden sage. When the hidden sage tried breaking through the limitations of the god of steam and machinery, in the hall of the Antigonus Hall that was sealed by layers of plants, Klein extended his slippery and strange tentacles to grab the translucent mask that represented the fool's uniqueness before moving it towards his face. Just as the mask covered Klein's face, numerous figures appeared around him. Some of them were men wearing postman uniforms. Some were ordinary birds, while others were microbes that couldn't be seen with the naked eye. There were hundreds or thousands of them. The hall that only had corpses hanging in the air suddenly became crowded. And the commonality of these figures was that they wore crystal monocles, or had a circular emblem of different colors in the same position. Amon. The avatars of Mr. Araramon. It was unknown if they had used the primordial demoness or the hidden sage's attacks to open a back door and use a loophole to secretly arrive near the target. Looking at Klein, who had just put on the translucent mask and was beginning to accommodate the fool's uniqueness, these omens revealed a smile at the same time. They opened their mouths and said words that ordinary people wouldn't be capable of understanding. These words intertwined and formed terrifying and crazy ravings. You overlooked the primordial demoness. For her Medici, who has only recovered to sequence 1, is no threat at all. Her greatest wish right now is to immediately produce a Lord of the Mysteries and open the seal of the Western continent, allowing her to have a chance of finding the City of Calamity. It's obvious that, compared to you, I'm the better choice. You're too weak. Haha. Are you still waiting for the Mother Tree of Desire or the Mother Goddess of Depravity to provide you with help? It's useless. I placed the first blasphemy slate into the fog sea and placed it near the abyss's entrance, not far from that primitive island. Also, the enhanced seal brought about by the corresponding authority of doors, and half of the Lord of the Astral World's control towards the world barrier prevents any outer deity from being able to have their powers penetrate inside for a short period. And without the influence of the outer deities, the dark side of the universe and the chained god currently do not wish to interfere in the battle of gods. They would rather seize this opportunity to escape their restraints. They also wish that a Lord of the Mysteries would be born as soon as possible to help them escape from the predicament. If it wasn't for the fact that stirring them would also trigger the outer deity corruption in them, I can promise you that I would have already reached an agreement with them to deal with you together. Amon was deliberately using real information to fill up the ravings, using this to make Klein suffer the effects of a two-pronged approach. One was the mental corruption brought about by the ravings, and the other was the corresponding content that distracted him. In any case, it wasn't a waste of time to him. On the one hand, he had sufficient avatars. Each worm of time saying one word was enough for him to form many words. On the other hand, he forcefully fused the information together, making a single word represent many things. At that instant, the ravings of Amon echoed in Klein's mind like sharp blades that pierced through his psyche, tearing through his mind. Normally, Klein could use his own status to suppress the ravings that were at most at the level of a sequence 1. It wouldn't affect him, but at this moment, he was accommodating the fool's uniqueness. His mental state was in a weak and subtle balance. Under such a scene, a straw might crush the camel's back, much less so many of Amon's avatars. Furthermore, while Klein felt a sharp pain in his psyche and his self-awareness was in a mess, the sleeping mental imprint of Antigonus and the will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings showed signs of awakening. In a sense, eternal slumber was an extreme seal. The almonds, who had accommodated Door's uniqueness, could undoubtedly be able to weaken the seal or even make it lose its effectiveness. Also, the translucent mask that Klein had just worn on his face, the fool's uniqueness obtained an even stronger remnant will from the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. It was also gradually breaking free from the influence of eternal slumber, and it had a certain resonance effect with the same being in Klein's body. Without using any beyonder powers, the almonds, who had simply created a few ravings, had thrown Klein into a state of imbalance, and he was on the brink of losing control. Furthermore, all of this seemed irreversible unless there was more river water from the river of eternal darkness that allowed Antigonus's mental imprint and the even more powerful will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings to continue sleeping. But at this moment, even if there was still the river water of the river of eternal darkness, the Evernight goddess wasn't able to divert her attention. This was because she was trying her best to suppress the dual pathway true god, Amon. From this point of view, the almonds were deliberately sacrificing their true body to stall the Evernight goddess, to create an opportunity for the avatars to destroy Klein's ritual. This was a little risky, but the result looked pretty good. At that moment, Klein's pocket lit up. The light was a pale golden color like sticky syrup. It instantly enveloped the surrounding area. Illuminated by this light included Klein and his avatar, as well as the book that was suddenly thrown over by the distant marionette. 0-02. Trunsoist Brass Book. The sealed artifact extended its body in midair. As it bathed in the pale golden light, a rule suddenly appeared on the blank page. It was completely different from the repeated laws from before. Speaking is prohibited here. Amon's avatars kept opening and closing their mouths, but they could no longer make a sound. A line appeared under the previous rule an instant later. Attacking each other is prohibited here. Pa! The Trunsoist Brass Book fell to the ground and spread open by Klein's feet. Under the illumination of the magic wishing lamp, it actually managed to break free from the repeated cycle from before, and it set up rules that were beneficial to Klein. With just a glance, the almonds made different responses. A portion of them adjusted their monocles, and together, they raised their right hands and gently clenched it, using the corresponding authority to strengthen the seal. On the Trunsoist Brass Book, a line of text before those rules gradually formed. All the following rules are ineffective. Another portion of almonds locked onto Klein, who was on the boundary of losing control. Not being able to attack him didn't mean that stealing and gifting were prohibited. Chapter 1378 Change of Plans on the different almonds' faces. The monocles in different forms emitted pure light. This was something they had stolen from the depths of the ruins of the Battle of Gods. It came from the ancient sun god's eternal daytime effect there. It could purify filthy and evil objects, and awaken sleeping creatures. They gifted this to Klein. This, combined with the ability to control the strength of seals obtained from the apprentice domain's authority, was enough to break the state of eternal slumber. In that instant, the mental imprint of Antigonus and the will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in Klein's body awakened. The madness, the vastness, cruelty, bloodthirstiness, and coldness were like an invisible storm that wreaked havoc in Klein's mind. Almost at the same time, in the fool's uniqueness that he wore on his face without fully accommodating it, the powerful will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings seemed like a terrifying monster that had been sleeping in the darkness for thousands of years. It suddenly opened its eyes. The former chaos and loss of control swept over again at that instant, but Klein didn't panic. Following one of his contingency plans, he calmly used the grafting ability to guide the mental imprint of Antigonus to celestial worthy's will in the fool's uniqueness, allowing the 2,000 years of entanglement between them to collide again. Meanwhile, Klein relied on his own consciousness and the anchors from the fool and the sea god believers to balance out the celestial worthy's will contained within his beyonder characteristic, just like when he separated out the attendant of mysteries marionette. If there weren't any accidents, and if this continued, there was a chance that Klein would be able to balance between the two sides and completely accommodate the fool's uniqueness. He would enter the final stage of the ritual, but how could there be no accidents when he was surrounded by almonds? Several almonds strengthened the seal of the Trunsoist Brass Book and the magic wishing lamp to resist the former's rule limitations. Some almonds gave the eternal daytime to Klein, and a small number of almonds locked onto Klein and attempted a theft. They were trying to steal his lucidity. One Amon failed after another, but in the end, there were still a few almonds who succeeded. They stole away Klein's self-awareness for the next 2 seconds. Klein's thoughts blurred. Without his guidance, the Antigonus's mental imprint, the 2 wills of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, as well as the anchors from his believers instantly lost their balance and began to madly invade, influence and corrupt each other. Everything became extremely chaotic, and it was as if it was developing irreversibly. Klein's body collapsed inch by inch, turning into clusters of transparent and distorted maggots as he extended even more slippery and sinister tentacles. And at this moment, the rules on the Trunsoist brass book were wiped away and began writing. Speaking is prohibited here. Attacking each other is prohibited here. Soon after, a familiar text appeared before the 2 rules. All the following rules are ineffective. After the seal was strengthened, the Trunsoist brass book seemed to enter a new cycle, and the influence the genie exerted on it became rather limited. Klein's consciousness quickly regained lucidity, but the situation in his body was completely chaotic and out of control. This made him completely unable to deal with the different influences or have any hope of finding a new sense of balance. In other words, he would run down the path of losing control until he became a monster. Without any time to think, Klein initiated his final contingency plan using his instincts and experience. He instantly gave up on saving his body and no longer focused on this matter. Not only that, but Klein had also even allowed the Attendant of Mysteries marionette to turn into a whirlpool of maggots and let it fuse with his body along with Zeradal's mental imprint. He wanted to mess things up. However, Amon's avatars wouldn't allow him to make any attempts. Apart from the Amons who were fighting against the magic wishing lamp and the Trunsoist brass book, the rest of them began to steal once again, trying to throw Klein's thoughts into chaos again until he completely lost control. The Amon in the postman uniform succeeded, but what he stole wasn't Klein's lucidity, but a drop of fresh blood. This blood immediately seeped into Postman Amon's palm. Right on the heels of that, Postman Amon's eyes turned crimson as his stomach bulged at an unimaginable speed as it squirmed. Heap seemed to be pregnant with a child. Heap had stolen the blood blessed by the primordial moon, or in other words, the mother goddess of depravity. Klein no longer placed most of his consciousness on balancing the Antigonus's mental imprint, the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, and his anchors. There was no need for him to endure it passively like before. He could barely respond to Amon's theft. Izeno he used grafting to change the target that Amon had stolen to Sapphira Castle and tampered it to the junk pile, replacing it with the blessed blood of the primordial moon. This was from Shaman King Klaman. There was no doubt that there was a certain connection between Amon's avatars. Furthermore, it was impossible for their levels to reach sequence 0. Therefore, when the postman Amon was contaminated by that drop of blood, the other Amons also showed levels of chaos. Some of their stomachs protruded as well. Some of their eyes were dyed crimson, while others had invisible babies in their arms as they walked in circles on the spot. This caused the other theft to inevitably fail. Klein seized this opportunity and used the brief moment of lucidity to stir the power of Sapphira Castle to cast a shadow over the ancient palace. This place was once again concealed. Then, he ignored the mental imprint of Antigonus in his body, Zeradal's mental imprint, and the 2 wills of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings that was beginning to fuse together. He made the blank-faced avatar which stood nearby without having shown any breakdown to extend his hand towards his main body. Its 5 fingers quickly closed, and its wrist quickly twisted. As Klein's self-consciousness didn't resist and even took the initiative to cooperate, his avatar didn't suffer many failures before using the help from Sapphira Castle to successfully steal his own consciousness, fate, anchors, and most of his identities. The only identity he left behind in his main body was his identity related to the Fool. At the same time, he had also stolen the identity, fate, and mental imprint of the Antigonus family's ancestor, the mark of fate and spirit. This could only succeed in a few tries thanks to his self-consciousness cooperating as the stream of light with countless distributaries appeared. Klein's avatar's face contorted as it turned into Klein Moretti, who had fused with Gehrman Sparrow's traits. He had become the main body without any beyonder characteristics. Of course, his self-consciousness and anchors were still resisting the mental imprint of the Antigonus family's ancestor, but compared to before, this was undoubtedly much easier to deal with. Having already adapted to the identity of Antigonus, he quickly found a new balance, delaying the fate of losing control. Although this remained unavoidable, it gave him a certain amount of time for his subsequent actions. On the other side, in the spot where Klein's original body was, there was only the Fool's uniqueness, all the Beyonder characteristics from the curtain, the Beyonder characteristics that originated from Zeratul, the tiny number of Beyonder characteristics which Klein had consumed and digested previously, as well as the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, the remnant mental imprint of Zeratul, as well as the fool's identity. And without Klein's self-consciousness, Antigonus's mental imprint, and the large number of anchors involved, Zeratul's remnant mental imprint was quickly destroyed and corroded by the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. In the next second, Klein's main body suddenly fell silent. The collapse of his body stopped. He lowered his head and stopped extending the slippery and sinister tentacles around him. He was so quiet that he appeared to have lost his soul. In such a scene, the silence was even more terrifying than madness. That frozen body seemed to be giving birth to an extremely terrifying monster. Klein didn't care about what was happening. He quickly grafted the partial connection between himself and his main body above the gray fog. Then, he shifted his target and locked onto Antigonus, who was on the huge stone chair. Without receiving Amon's help, the former half-fool failed to escape from his state of eternal slumber. Klein once again reached out his right hand, stealing the remaining sequence 9 and 1 Beyonder characteristics of the other party. Although he was currently using the identity and fate of Antigonus, it was still difficult for him to complete the theft. Failure was inevitable. At that moment, outside the realm of mysteries created by Sapphira Castle, Amon regained his consciousness from the initial chaos. They raised their hands and adjusted their monocles, causing the redness in their eyes to vanish. Others looked down at their stomachs and reached out to stroke them. A second later, the bulging stomach split open, and baby after baby with faint crimson colors appeared. These infants didn't cry, nor were they deformed. All of them took out crystal monocles from the void in smooth succession and wore them to their right eye. The number of almonds increased. He had converted the babies which were due, turning them into his avatars so as to prevent the corruption of the primordial moon from interfering with him. At this moment, Earth Mother and God of Steam and Machinery had achieved the upper hand to some extent on their respective battlefields. They could finally make use of this small advantage to interfere with the situation inside the palace. Instantly, a portion of almonds turned into plants as they bloomed or bore fruit, returning to the land. A portion of almonds became knowledge, information, and words, as they ended up imprinted into an illusory book. However, there were still some almonds who had used blink, relied on loopholes, or from using the deception of the rules to successfully avoid the influence of the two true deities. As they continued to strengthen the seal of the magic wishing lamp and the Trunsoist brass book, they opened a door in Klein's realm of mysteries. At the same time, the angels also noticed the changes in the astral world, but their gazes were unable to penetrate the Earth Mother's natural barrier and the God of Steam and Machinery civilization picture. They couldn't see the interior at all. This also meant that, even if they wanted to exert influence, there was nothing they could do. Inside the realm of mysteries created by Sapphira Castle, Klein finally succeeded in stealing the Beyonder characteristics of Antigonus from Sequence 9 to Sequence 1, ones that had been digested. Due to the law of Beyonder characteristic convergence, the latter had attracted many Beyonders of the same pathway over a long span of history. While turning them into marionettes, he had also absorbed their Beyonder characteristics. Therefore, at that moment, there was still a large number of seer pathway Beyonder characteristics left in Antigonus's body, including a miracle invoker Beyonder characteristic. The dark points of light quickly merged into Klein's body and fused with him. As he was now Antigonus, and as all the Beyonder characteristics had been digested by Antigonus, his fate of losing control didn't speed up as he maintained his previous progress. This way, Klein had once again become a Sequence 1 attendant of mysteries, one who had already digested the potion, with a fate that pointed towards losing control. At this moment, his original main body raised his head, his eyes dark. However, from this glance, the present Klein's mind instantly slowed down as his body turned cold. He almost had no way of resisting it. The powerful will that he was very familiar with began to slowly rise, attempting to influence Sapphira Castle. The Lord of the Mysteries had awakened to a certain threshold in Klein's main body. The Fool had become a truly great existence that was being awakened. It matched the guess of the Tarot Club and was in conflict with true history. Before Klein's thoughts slowed down, he took the initiative to cooperate with Amon and dispelled the realm of mysteries, allowing the situation inside to interact with the outside world. He had already fooled history without any problems, just like the first plan he came up with. As for how to end it, he never had a good idea. According to the changes in the situation, The final plan he activated at this critical moment was to not leave himself any way out. He would go from accommodating the fool's uniqueness to advancing to the true fool. In any case, this wouldn't be worse than the previous situation. Chapter 1379. Combining forces. The curtain that enveloped the Antigonus palace instantly vanished. An indescribable aura returned to reality, causing the entire astral world to shake. Outside the world barrier that was covered in cracks, the terrifying, indescribable faces suddenly changed. The invisible barrier began to tremble violently as if it would collapse at any moment. Every continent on the planet within experienced an earthquake. It wasn't a serious one, just rather obvious. Above the 5 seas, waves surged, as if they had encountered a sudden tidal force. Amid the noon sky, the crimson moon suddenly appeared. Its color became extremely saturated and expanded in an exaggerated manner. It was as if it had hung off the roofs of every house. Other than that, the brown planet, orange planet, scarlet planet, gold planet, and blue planet lit up at the same time, emitting light of different textures. If one looked down from the cosmos, the entire Earth appeared to be swept up by an invisible storm and trembled in place. This was a slight change brought about by the outer deities' attempt to break the barrier. The aura that floated inside the ancient palace in the astral world had made them collectively recall that terrifying existence. Agitated by this, either a result of rage or madness, all of them tried to stop his revival. Compared to them, who were blocked outside the real world, the first to react was the magic wishing lamp in the pocket of Klein's main body. The sticky pale golden light penetrated through the Amon's enhanced seal, turning into a blurry and distorted figure. It stretched out its arm and pulled the Trunsoist brass book into its palm. The rules that were written previously had all disappeared, and a new article immediately formed. Resurrection of the deceased is prohibited here. A faint grayish-white fog flashed and a familiar text appeared in front of this rule. All the following rules are ineffective. Even though he hadn't really resurrected and had yet to absorb the fool's uniqueness and 2 sequence 9 to sequence 1 seer pathway beyonder characteristics, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in Klein's main body could also control Sapphira Castle and use its status to direct its powers. At this moment, his existence and the fog of history had completed their interactions. Fragments of light began to distort as they merged into one, sometimes breaking apart, unable to completely form a piece of history. A sense of self-conflict appeared in that piece of history. True history clearly involved the prehistoric human soul, Klein Moretti, disguising himself as the fool and establishing the Tarot Club. He became stronger one sequence at a time, and eventually reached the level of the true fool. However, the present history was that Mr. Fool was a great existence that was awakening, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings from ancient times. He had finally awakened. At that moment, although the rule restriction put in effect by the genie using the Trunsoist brass book could only be effective for less than a second, it still significantly weakened the will of the Lord of the Mysteries inside Klein's main body, as though he had suffered a fatal blow. As for Earth Mother and God of Steam and Machinery, they had given up on interfering with Amon's avatars, as though they wanted this Mr. Error to have the time to deal with the awakening Lord of the Mysteries. However, they, who clearly had some power to spare, didn't attempt to affect Klein's main body, but continued suppressing the primordial Demoness and the hidden sage. The subsequent attacks and interferences from the latter two were no longer intense, as if they were waiting for an outcome. To them, the resurrection of the Lord of the Mysteries was the achieving of their goals. Produce a pillar as quickly as possible, and prevent entities that had animosity towards them from becoming the Lord of the Mysteries. In addition, the pathways that they were in didn't belong to the 3 pathways that were controlled by the Lord of the Mysteries. Furthermore, they didn't have any feuds or conflicts of interest with the other party. Amon, who was no longer affected, immediately changed his target and focused most of his attention on Klein's main body. There was no need for any explanation. They clearly knew that this was their greatest threat. Without any hesitation, the Amons raised their right hands at the same time and gently squeezed it, seriously stealing the effects of the eternal daytime from the target. However, the Amons didn't give up influencing Klein. With their numbers, they split off a small number of members and looked at Klein, who was currently a Sequence 1 attendant of mysteries. Furthermore, Klein also bore the identity of Antigonus. The monocles of these Amons suddenly lit up. Using the authority related to doors, they moved Klein out of the real world and into the cosmos. In the dark and vast universe, Klein's figure appeared. Then, it instantly became thin, turning into a paper figurine. The paper figurine first had its belly bloated before giving birth to a paper baby. Then, it rapidly rotted into dust. Klein had used grafting and paper figurine substitutes to block the attacks of the almonds. At the same time, the other almonds had succeeded in stealing the effects of the eternal daytime from Klein's main body. However, in the next second, the effects of the eternal daytime were once again stolen back. This was the Lord of the Mysteries' control over powers from his pathway. Even though Hebe had yet to fully revive, Hebe had already begun this process. Amon's eyes flickered as he immediately gave up on Klein and focused on three matters. Most of them continued to steal the effects of the eternal daytime and resist the Lord of the Mysteries, while a small number of them locked onto Antigonus, who was sitting on the huge stone chair. They began to steal the other party's state of eternal slumber. In addition, all the almonds had dispelled the strengthening of seals, and even weakened them. Klein, who was no longer being attacked by Amon, similarly didn't counterattack. His attention was focused on his main body. The awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries was the biggest problem. At that instant, an illusory mark appeared on Klein's glabella. It was a strange door of light that was stained with hints of bluish-black. It constantly emanated a faint grayish-white fog. Klein began to snatch control over Sapphira Castle from the Lord of the Mysteries, so that it wouldn't be so easy for him to make use of the level and power. And with the Lord of the Mysteries not fully resurrected and having yet to accommodate the Fool's uniqueness and the corresponding Beyonder characteristics, he could effectively reduce his strength, allowing his failure rate to increase significantly and for the effects to be inferior. With his addition, with his control over Sapphira Castle, the fooling received by the Trunsoist brass book immediately weakened. The chances of Amon's theft also increased. In the forsaken land of the gods, at the foot of the giant shadow formed by the ancient sun god, on the surface of the sea that was covered in all colors, words written in the most ancient language quickly appeared. The revival of the Lord of the Mysteries failed due to many interferences. With this sentence forming, as Klein fought for control over Sapphira Castle, the almonds once again stole the effects of the eternal daytime effects that had augmented the Lord of the Mysteries. Elsewhere, they had also stolen Antigonus's state of eternal slumber. Without any hesitation, the almonds transferred the state of eternal slumber to Klein's main body and gifted it to the Lord of the Mysteries. The ancient existence's aura immediately fell silent, but it quickly rebounded. At this moment, the corresponding text appeared on the weakly sealed Trunsoist brass book. Resurrection of the deceased is prohibited here. Suddenly, the terrifying will in Klein's main body rapidly weakened, producing a strong urge to fall asleep again. However, this will was so powerful that, even after a long period of time, it was unable to completely wear it down. Under these two restrictions, it was still tenacious and slowly recovering. It also attempted to use tampering and fooling to get out of the predicament. Klein sensed that the other party was using Sapphira Castle's power, so he immediately focused and interfered. At the same time, the Evernight goddess, who was floating above the ancient palace, slightly relaxed her control over Amon's true body. She pulled back the bird-shaped, golden accessory and aimed its head downwards. Inside the bronze eye of the bird-shaped, golden accessory, illusory layers of doors surged out, allowing a drop of colorless water that had a strong aura of stillness to drop onto Klein's main body in the ancient palace. This was a drop of river water from the river of eternal darkness. While the Evernight goddess was doing this, Amon's actual body's attempt to escape by opening doors also tacitly slowed down. The drop of water plummeted at an extremely fast speed. The natural barrier formed by Earth Mother and the portrait formed by the god of steam and machinery simultaneously pulled back to give way for it. With a smack, the river water of the river of eternal darkness accurately dripped onto Klein's head and silently entered. The aura of the Lord of the Mysteries, which was slowly growing, immediately receded. It stopped its fluctuation and fell into a state of eternal slumber. However, this condition wasn't very stable, as if it could be broken at any moment. At this moment, the Evernight goddess's empty hand pulled out a gigantic sword from the void. The sword's surface was covered with orange-red light as it exuded the dawn of twilight, the aura of decay. This was the symbol of the Twilight Giant. The Evernight goddess's arm that was covered with short black fur extended, striking down with the exaggerated sword. She had always kept some energy as though prepared to deliver this moment. In the strange sound of the void shattering and decaying, the sword that was covered with the light of twilight slashed through the dome of the Antigonus palace, causing the hanging corpses to drop to the ground. Right on the heels of that, It struck Klein's main body, which had yet to escape the state of eternal slumber. The portion of the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries rapidly vanished, and the body began to wane uncontrollably. It broke down along with the Fool's uniqueness and the two sets of sequence 9 to 1 beyonder characteristics in his body. They also collapsed and gathered together. Upon seeing this, Klein followed his plan without any thought. He used Sapphira Castle to pull down a quarter of the fog of history and enveloped it. Amidst the grayish-white fog, the Fool's uniqueness and the beyonder characteristics fully converged. They frantically absorbed the fog of history around them, turning into a shapeless and dark liquid. This blob of liquid stretched out as though it was forming a strange, translucent hooded cloak or a person whose internal organs and flesh were emptied out. The Fool's potion. The almonds reached out their right hands at the same time in a bid to steal the potion. Chapter 1380. A miracle. More than 1,000 almonds each committed theft. With his numbers, as long as he wasn't extremely unlucky, there would always be a few who would have succeeded. Furthermore, the Fool's potion was ownerless, so it wasn't difficult to steal. While carrying out the theft, Amon removed a particular seal on his body, allowing the apprentice and marauder beyonder characteristics to release their powers of convergence. This was rather effective towards the Fool's potion, allowing Amon to increase his success rate to the greatest extent. However, all the almonds ultimately failed. This was because a new rule had appeared on the Trunsoist brass book. Acts of theft are prohibited here. In order to deal with the awakening Lord of the Mysteries, Amon had weakened all the seals here and helped the Trunsoist brass book escape the fooling. It could now have a limited number of effective rules for a brief moment amidst its repeated cycles. But now, this had adversely affected them. Seizing this opportunity, the illusory brand between Klein's brows became more obvious. A faint grayish-white fog gathered around him, forming a thin cocoon. He activated Sapphira Castle with all his might. Together with his attendant of mysteries beyonder characteristic, he created an extremely powerful convergence effect on the Fool's potion. The black liquid that didn't have a fixed form seemed to be a starving beast that saw food. It immediately pounced onto Klein. It kept extending and changing like a translucent skin, wrapping Klein inside. Klein's face appeared underneath this liquid. His facial features were sometimes distinct, sometimes blurred, sometimes distorted, and sometimes blank. In the forsaken land of the gods, under the giant shadow formed by the ancient sun god, words in the most ancient of languages rapidly took form on the illusory surface of the sea that contained all possible colors. Antigonus's efforts at advancing to the Fool ultimately failed due to various reasons. The reason why this existence that once dominated the entire planet didn't use Klein Moretti's name was that he was now carrying the identity and fate of Antigonus. If the subject in the sentence had been the former name, then Klein could completely ignore it. What had Klein Moretti's failed advancement got to do with Antigonus becoming the Fool? But when the subject became Antigonus, it was like a prophecy, as if it was an arrangement that had the outcome already be decided. Such a sentence could make the situation turn very grim. If Klein didn't give up on Antigonus's identity and fate, he would be restricted by those words. If he gave up Antigonus's identity and fate, then the sequence 9 and 1 beyond a characteristic in his body would no longer belong to him in the true sense of the word. He had never digested them before. They were beyonder characteristics that Antigonus once controlled. At present, it had nothing to do with Klein Moretti. All he did was forcefully devour them. Under such circumstances, even if there were no other factors, just the undigested beyonder characteristics would likely cause Klein to lose control on the spot. And consuming the Fool's potion in such a state and completing the advancement ritual was without a doubt impossible. As the ancient sun god wrote this sentence, the eternal blazing sun, the Lord of Storms, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, who were situated in the astral world, sensed something. Each of them launched the most intense of counterattacks in an attempt to interfere with the other party's actions. However, even though a large portion of his energy was spent restricting the three true deities, making it rather difficult, the ancient sun god quickly completed the sentence. However, his giant shadow embodiment dimmed, as though he was unable to maintain it for too long. In the astral world, within the floating ancient palace, in the battle that pit the Earth Mother and the god of steam and machinery against the primordial Demoness and hidden sage, the situation became even more intense. However, the former two were still able to divert a certain amount of strength to affect Amon's avatar, preventing them from destroying Klein's advancement ritual. The almonds were forced to blink everywhere, but some of them still turned into plants, blooming and bearing fruit before returning to the land. Others collapsed into words as they were imprinted into illusory books. Apart from that, a large number of them were strengthening the seal, limiting the Trunsoist brass book, preventing the rules it enacted from being effective, or be effective for only an instant. Under the influence of these three factors, even with Amon's numbers, it appeared to be insufficient. But even so, a small number of them managed to seize the opportunity to make crystal monocles and similar circular symbols reflect Klein's figure. In the next second, the monocles and circular symbols emitted pure light. This wasn't theft, but the act of returning things. At this moment, Amon's decision was to return an item that he had formerly stolen from Klein. It was Klein's thoughts of suicide. Back when Klein was captured by Amon and brought to the forsaken land of the gods, he had tried on many occasions to commit suicide but failed to succeed. He had such thoughts stolen by the other party. At the critical moment of his advancement, once he had the intention to commit suicide, the outcome could be imagined. At that moment, Klein, who was tightly enveloped by the fool's potion, felt his thoughts turn chaotic and wander. His hair spread out as he felt an extremely cold, sticky liquid slowly invade him. Then, he had the thought of committing suicide and giving up. This was a change that Klein had never expected. He had long forgotten how Amon had stolen his thoughts of committing suicide. Furthermore, he didn't expect that not only was the other party unwilling to abandon these thoughts, he had even kept them carefully. If it were any time in the past, this thought might have been strong, but Klein could still use his self-control to resist it forcefully, suppressing it until it dissipated on its own. It would be akin to dealing with nasty thoughts. But now, he was in the midst of an advancement ritual. He was being influenced by the potion, and his mind had lost its stability. He was unable to effectively suppress the thought of committing suicide. The almonds always had various strange but rather effective methods. Fortunately, Klein wasn't only Klein, but also Antigonus. What relation did Klein Moretti's thoughts of committing suicide have to do with Antigonus? With this level of knowledge from this additional identity, Klein didn't immediately give up and end his life. He pulled the Antigonus mental imprint in his body and mixed it with the idea of suicide, barely suppressing it. Under such a balance, Klein's mind and body were further corroded by the fool's potion. His thoughts were the same as when he advanced to Attendant of Mysteries, completely dispersed. But the difference was that he didn't fuse with the spirit world this time. Instead, he continued to extend, enveloping the entire planet, the entire spirit world, and part of the astral world like a gaseous body. At that moment, Klein felt that he was in the bodies of different believers, in every human's body, in every animal's body, in every living thing. Everything had godhood in them. At the same time, he was still scattered within the fog of history, scattered through fleeting time, and scattered inside the silent flow of a river of light with multiple distributaries. One was also infinity. At the level of godhood, an experience like this made Klein's thoughts wear away even further, as though all that was left was a coldness that looked down on everything. Even this coldness was dissipating slowly. It wouldn't be long before Klein completely lost himself and was led by the various mental seals in the fool's potion, becoming a true monster. This coincided with Antigonus's crazy fate, allowing the latter to accelerate. At this moment, he felt something off. It was unharmonious, unnatural, and abnormal. In the fog of history, there were a small number of light fragments twisting and distorting, unable to take form. It was as if there was a fundamental conflict between them. They gradually separated, breaking out into different branches to record the different content, allowing the twisting to achieve the initial state of recovering. Being imbued into everything, Klein's mind was thrown out due to this tiny disharmonious abnormality. He found some aspect of self-awareness again. With this self-awareness as the core, he quickly gathered his scattered mind and guided the fusion process between the fool's potion and his body. But at this moment, the fate of Antigonus losing control thanks to the ancient sun god's prophecy erupted early. Klein's body collapsed once again, unable to withstand the fool's potion. Without any hesitation or having the luxury of time to hesitate, Klein immediately removed a portion of the theft effects and returned Antigonus, his identity, fate, and self-awareness, allowing him sitting on the huge stone chair to slowly open his eyes. The dazed Antigonus gradually regained his clarity of mind. He didn't immediately lose control, because the main reason he lost control was that the Lord of the Mysteries had awakened to a large extent. And now, the fool's uniqueness and most of the beyonder characteristics that contained a portion of the will was no longer in his body. Therefore, Antigonus could use his own will to resist the madness and try to stop the fate of losing control. The prophecy of the ancient sun god came true. Antigonus really failed to advance to Sequence 0 the Fool. And without his identity, the Sequence 9 and Sequence 1 beyonder characteristic of the seer pathway in Klein's body turned into something that he hadn't digested. This threw him to the edge of losing control immediately. The Fool's potion that wrapped around his body like a cloak instantly completed the act of seeping through. The will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings was awakened once again. Give up. Leave everything to me. This time, I won't accommodate another Sapphira. I won't help you protect the living creatures you wish to protect, but I won't harm them either. It's not that I won't keep my promises, but it's just that they're too weak and not worth my attention. This place is an area that is off-limits to outer deities. The unfamiliar yet weirdly familiar ravings reverberated in Klein's heart, giving him the idea of giving up. And the thought of committing suicide that he had been suppressed by Antigonus's mental imprint previously, surfaced again after the balance created by it was lost. The outcome of failing an advancement attempt was about to occur. At this moment, the Evernight goddess, who was originally powerless to slash downwards with the Twilight Sword, suddenly gave up on controlling Amon's true body. As Amon's true body leaped out, and just as the avatars waited for Klein to fail the ritual, the goddess once again dragged the exaggerated sword that was covered in orange light. This time, the target was Klein. A thought flashed through Klein's mind as he took the initiative to be controlled by the thought of committing suicide, not making any attempts to resist. With a poof, he was slashed by the symbolic sword of twilight, shattering into a rotten body of meat that seeped out beyonder characteristics. Klein died. Before the Amons took any sort of measures against him, he was killed by the Evernight goddess before the ritual failed and before he completely lost control. In the next second, the Evernight goddess wore the bird-shaped, golden accessory on her head as her body expanded and enveloped the ancient palace. She instantly erased Amon's true body, avatars, Earth Mother, primordial Demonis, god of steam and machinery, hidden sage, and Antigonus, as though they were erased by an eraser. Concealment. The ancient sun god seemed to understand what the Evernight goddess wanted to do, but having already made 2 prophecies, there was no way for him to write a 3rd sentence. As for the 3 true gods, they continued throwing what they had at him, holding him back. In the next second, a miracle happened. Klein returned from the fog of history. The uniqueness of the Fool that had already belonged to him and the 3 Sequence 9 to Sequence 1 beyonder characteristics rapidly returned to his body. Afraid that he would be disturbed, the genie quickly made use of the Trunsoist brass book to add a rule. This place is suitable for the return of beyonder characteristics. Suddenly, Klein returned to his previous state of him drinking the Fool potion. But the thing that was different from before was that, back then, his body's pillar of support belonged to the Sequence 9 to Sequence 1 beyonder characteristics of Antigonus, ones he hadn't digested yet. And now, the first to return to him was undoubtedly the digested Sequence 9 and 1 beyonder characteristic that once belonged to him. This way, he would have a true pillar of support that could accommodate the Fool's uniqueness and the remaining characteristics. Klein was in a state that was the same as when he first arrived at the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range, an attendant of mysteries who had finished digesting the potion and was capable of attempting to advance to Sequence 0 the Fool. By relying on his resurrection, Klein had completely overturned his state. This was the flash of inspiration he had obtained from Roselle's resurrection. Of course, the entire process was different from the resurrection of a Black Emperor. The character that Klein had arranged to kill him was the genie. He never expected that the Evernight goddess, who he hadn't discussed this with, would share such tacit understanding with him. In that instant, his body split apart, turning into a thin gray fog and dark liquid. The gray fog and black liquid blended together, and the countless maggots that resembled meat tendrils sprouted on the surface. Then, they intertwined into a translucent dark-colored cloak. There was no body under the cloak, just darkness. This process was very brief. In less than 2 seconds, the Evernight goddess's concealment of so many deities was clearly unable to last that long. In an instant, a door of light traveled across the surface of the concealed world at an extremely high speed. The door suddenly opened, and Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and wearing a classic black robe, leaped out. At the same time, Heap saw an illusory mask with blank facial features appear under the translucent dark-colored cloak. The mask instantly outlined Klein, who had fused with Gehrman Sparrow's traits. Amon's thoughts turned chaotic as though he had his intelligence forcefully lowered. The Fool was born. Chapter 1381 Authority Inside the White Tower, the headquarters of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. After Luca Brewster, who was trapped underground, completed his prayer, he focused his attention back on the seal autonomously strengthening itself. He wanted to find out exactly what was going on, to see if he could decipher the secrets hidden within and use them to invent some mystical techniques. As he proceeded down each level, checking each and every sealed artifact, Luca was taken aback and stopped in his tracks. His expression became rather confused. He was lost on whether to take his next step with his left foot or right foot. This seemed to be a very profound, esoteric question to comprehend. In the southern continent, beside a cathedral belonging to the Evernight goddess, Leonard picked up the cup of coffee made from local ground beans and wanted to take a sip. During this process, his thoughts wandered to the closed windows and the bright sky, trying to figure out the anomaly. However, he was unable to leave the room and was sealed here. As for Old Man, Palaz Zoroast, he had fallen into a strange state of silence without answering his questions. Thankfully, there wasn't any additional danger. Therefore, Leonard could still sit in peace, using thoughts to replace action. After an unknown period of time, he looked down at the cup of coffee that had been placed back on the table. He frowned slightly and muttered to himself in puzzlement. What did I want to do just now? The Rorstad Archipelago, in the concealed Biome City. Having not noticed the changes in the environment, Danitz carefully fiddled with the telegraph device in his room. The Golden Dream had recently come to the Sonia Sea and stopped at a port with a telegraph office. Danitz wanted to invite them over to Biome as guests to take in the grandeur of a Lord's Oracle. If possible, he wished that the Golden Dream could use Biome as its primary harbor. This way, he could return to the ship at any time to participate in adventures and seek out treasures. At the same time, he could choose to listen to the captain's lectures. As an all-rounder, Danitz had no doubt mastered all the knowledge and techniques needed to send a telegram. At that moment, he sat in front of the machine and quickly tapped his fingers, sending out the words he had constructed. At the very beginning, his thoughts were clear and his words were proper. This left him somewhat smug. Gradually, his eyes stared straight and his hands didn't stop moving, as if he was doing it on instinct. After the telegram was sent out, Danitz exhaled, picked up a cup, and gulped down a mouthful of beer. It was quicker than I expected. Even if I lose my job in the future, I can still go to the telegraph office to get a job with a good salary, Danitz thought proudly and worriedly. He casually picked up the telegram draft and recalled the process of how he sent it out. His expression gradually turned odd. What did I send in the end? Danitz couldn't help but whisper. Apparently, he had very likely mocked the first mate, second mate, Iron Skin, and Beryl towards the latter half of the telegram. Then, he passionately confessed to the captain. I'm finished. Why would I express what's hidden in my heart? Danitz's face turned pale as he suspected that he had been controlled by the potion. The content he had written didn't actually go through his head. He hurriedly sent a telegram to indicate that the content from before had nothing to do with him. It was all a result of Anderson deliberately causing trouble. At this moment, he realized that something was amiss outside. The sky was gray and there wasn't a single cloud. In the astral world, the existences and objects that had been concealed by the Evernight goddess broke through the restrictions and returned to reality one after another. They were like Amon's actual body, looking somewhat dazed without making any immediate reaction. In addition, the Evernight goddess also paused in midair in confusion, as though she hadn't thought about her subsequent actions. However, her first instinct was to protect herself. The Lord of Storms, the eternal blazing sun, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, who had been restricted by the thick prism-like spots of light in their own kingdoms, also experienced certain changes. The intensity of their counterattacks was clearly lower, giving people a sense of self-doubt, unsure if the entity before them was an enemy. The genie abandoned the Trunsoist brass book and directly returned to the magic wishing lamp. He seemed to have fought to his limits and had no choice but to retreat into the seal. He also seemed to recall something as he subconsciously evaded. Antigonus, who had just regained his self-awareness and lucidity, was once again confused. His face was filled with question marks. Who am I? Where am I? What am I doing? What is happening around me? In the forsaken land of the gods, the ancient sun god's giant shadow sighed and said, "Let there be light." The light in the astral world brightened as it stabbed into the eyes of Amon's true body, avatars, primordial demonis, hidden sage, and other existences. They immediately regained their senses and made use of the time to respond differently. The flood of information suddenly dispersed and fused with the various symbols around it, instantly disappearing. The black, python-like tentacles with an eyeball on their ends retracted rapidly. No one knew where they went. Amon's true body looked at Klein, who had just advanced, and gave up the chance to exert his influence while his condition was unstable. He raised his hand and adjusted the crystal monocle on his right eye. His figure split into multiple seemingly illusory and realistic doors. The doors opened and closed at the same time, preventing any existences like the Evernight goddess from knowing where Amon's true body had gone to. After Amon's true body left, his avatars faded and disappeared in a bizarre manner. This was using a loophole, turning the act of Amon's true body leaving to being equivalent to Amon's leaving. At the same time, the giant shadow that the ancient sun god had expanded only to shrink and transform back into Adam, who carried a thick shadow on his back. Beneath the feet of this visionary, the sea that contained all colors instantly dissipated as though it had returned underground. Looking up at the astral world, Adam returned to the back of that shadow screen through a crack. The fusion between him and the true creator had just begun, and it wasn't over yet. The attempt to raise himself to the level of half a great old one was actually rather difficult and risky. This would make their progress a lot slower in the future. In the astral world, as the war subsided, the natural barrier formed by plants and the portraits of civilization faded away, along with the illusory crimson moon. The Lord of Storms, eternal blazing sun, and the God of knowledge and wisdom first shattered the thick spots of light outside their divine kingdoms. Then, they calmed down and returned to continue blocking the world barrier's cracks. The Evernight goddess, who was floating above the ancient palace, put away the pitch-black coffin, the twilight sword, the bird-shaped, golden accessory, and her 4 arms. She cast her gaze downwards. After the translucent dark-colored cloak produced the mask, it transformed into Klein's body. Klein pressed one hand against the almost invisible mask on his face, and he placed the other at his abdomen. His back was slightly arched, as though he was suffering indescribable pain. Just as he raised his head and looked at the Evernight goddess's face that was covered with a thin black veil, a pitch-black cloak appeared outside his body. Slippery and sinister tentacles extended from beneath the cloak. After becoming the fool, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in him, had undoubtedly awakened further. The crazy ravings and roars continued to echo in Klein's ears, tearing through his mind, letting him know that this was going to be his future. There was no way to kill the Lord of the Mysteries. Even if his will was slowly worn down by time, his consciousness would remain forever. He could snatch Klein's body at any moment and completely revive. If it wasn't for the fact that he had just killed the Lord of the Mysteries' will, making the awakening him weaker than what Klein expected, Klein suspected that he might not be able to survive. All he could do was watch as his body collapsed and he became another existence. Of course, he could still seek the Evernight goddess's help to give him a drop of the river of eternal darkness's river water. However, this wasn't a long-term solution. He could only delay it for some time before ultimately facing it. Relying on his own consciousness and anchors, Klein stabilized the consciousness of the celestial worthy in him. At this moment, he was unable to speak. The Evernight goddess above nodded gently and said, "What you need now is stability." With that said, her figure was wiped inch by inch as she returned to the divine kingdom in the astral world. Klein turned his head to look at the slightly dazed Antigonus. With a thought, he returned to Sapphira Castle. Sitting in the half-collapsed palace, Antigonus sat on a huge stone chair. He felt as though he had just been through a very, very long dream. Inside Sapphira Castle, Klein sat at the fool's seat and focused on stabilizing his mental state. Just like before he achieved an initial level of stability, he had no way of seeking treatment from a psychiatrist. Unless he paid a visit to Adam, it was very likely that he would go even crazier. With some stability, Klein quickly checked the authorities he obtained. It was called fooling. Not only did it contain history, time, fate, change, and concealment, but it also included the mind domains of blind stupidity. The simplest application was to lower an enemy's intelligence. Just as Klein was about to research them further, his spiritual perception was triggered. Someone had invaded Sapphira Castle. And only when the enemy successfully invaded did Klein obtain a notification. Klein suddenly looked up and saw that the grayish-white fog had formed a door at the other end of the long mottled table. A figure wearing a pointed hat, a classic black robe, and a monocle walked out. Aman. There was a tinge of darkness in Mr. Era's eyes as his smile appeared somewhat crazy. He leisurely looked around and nudged his monocle. He said with a smile, "Are you pleasantly surprised?" Klein wanted to use Sapphira Castle to expel him, but he realized that at some point in time, Amon had gained control over Sapphira Castle. Amon cast his gaze at him, pulled out a chair and sat down, chuckling. "I released the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries in my body. Him being the owner of Sapphira Castle makes me equivalent to being the owner of Sapphira Castle. Of course I can enter. This is very risky. Even in the past, I didn't dare to try it before, but since you've grown to this extent, I can only take the risk. This is very exciting. I'm quite pleased with the effects." As Amon spoke, slippery and sinister tentacles appeared beneath his clothes. He took the initiative to revive part of the Lord of the Mysteries, allowing himself to enter a half-crazy state. As Amon spoke, Klein appeared to be listening, but he had actually attempted to leave Sapphira Castle. This wasn't because he wanted to give up or surrender, nor was it because he was too timid and subconsciously considered fleeing first. Instead, he believed that this was the best solution for the current situation. If he stayed in Sapphira Castle, Klein would face 3 difficult questions. Firstly, he had just advanced to the Fool and his condition was extremely unstable. He had to divert a large portion of his mental strength to suppress the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. Secondly, there was no way for him to obtain the help of his allies. He could only fight alone. Thirdly, under the situation that everyone could influence Sapphira Castle, even if Klein had a deeper level of control over Sapphira Castle, he wouldn't be able to express an overwhelming advantage. He might even be disrupted in his use of Sapphira Castle because his opponent was good at making use of loopholes and creating bugs, making it difficult for him to reach the same level as him. This way, when a sequence 0 the Fool faced a half-crazed, dual-pathway error and door, even if he wasn't in a scenario of facing a 100% failure rate, the chances of winning were extremely minute. And by taking the opportunity to escape Sapphira Castle, Klein could immediately obtain the help of his allies to reverse the situation between the two. If Amon were to chase after him, Klein would interfere with his return to Sapphira Castle and make him face his allies. At that time, the primordial Demonis would definitely not attack again. The ancient sun god might not be able to reproduce the power of half a great old one anytime soon. With the lead of the Evernight goddess, the 6 orthodox deities were enough to deal with Amon. Even if Amon, who was in control of all the authorities of the error and door domains, wasn't easily killed, the orthodox deities would definitely be able to weaken him and seal him. After Klein stabilized his mental state and deepened his control over Sapphira Castle, he could then kill him in a targeted manner. This process was almost irreversible. Even if the ancient sun god could still produce the level, status and strength from before, his limit appeared to be suppressing 3 orthodox deities at the same time, and this didn't include the Evernight goddess. Of course, the outer deities were undoubtedly unwilling to see the birth of a new Lord of the Mysteries. Once such a situation happened, they would definitely try their best to interfere, preventing Amon from dying. However, before the world barrier collapsed, the influence they could exert would be rather limited, and it might not be of much use. Just like before, Klein believed that the combined powers of the dark side of the universe and the chained god were inferior to the hidden sage. Even if the outer deities managed to affect the situation, Klein wouldn't suffer any losses. After all, those existences wouldn't allow Amon to kill him either. He could find a place to hide and stabilize his mental state. Once he was prepared, he could make new plans again. The foggy town of the Evernight goddess was a very good choice. If Amon didn't chase after him and remained inside Sapphira Castle, Klein could use his identity as the owner of Sapphira Castle to influence the control of all kinds of matters within at any moment, preventing Amon from doing anything in Sapphira Castle. Even if he wanted to use the Crimson Star to deal with the Tarot Club members, it would be impossible. In short, it would be extremely difficult for either of them to use Sapphira Castle well, but destroying the other party's attempts was definitely simple. Under such a stalemate, Klein had time to stabilize his mental state, deepening his control over Sapphira Castle, slowly turning the situation around. Towards the end, Amon would either flee and hide, or he would let the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings completely revive, choosing to have an internecine outcome with Klein. Therefore, although he didn't have the time to analyze the pros and cons, Klein quickly came to a conclusion. Leaving Sapphira Castle now was the best choice. However, just as his consciousness sank to the edge of Sapphira Castle, he saw a crystal monocle. This item appeared in time, crushing Klein's hopes of escaping. Did you think I'd leave such an obvious loophole? Of course, you can stop me from leaving Sapphira Castle at any time. Amon curled his index finger and pressed it against the monocle as he smiled. Behind the chair that he was sitting on, the resplendent symbol rapidly changed. At times, it was formed from symbols corresponding to parasitizing, time, and fate. At times, it was a series of doors. These two different symbols appeared one after another, making it impossible to truly be fixed. Klein didn't hear what Amon said. The moment he failed, he created a real realm of mysteries, a complete divine kingdom of the fool. Light and shadows instantly changed in front of Amon's eyes. It brought with it the disappearance of the grand palace, model table, and luxurious high-back chair, bringing with it an ancient castle. Amon wasn't sure what the ancient castle looked like. This was because he was standing in a corridor inside the castle. He could only sense the various changes in Sapphira Castle and see with the limited vision he had. The corridor was unusually dark and gloomy. The corridor stretched endlessly. There were silver-colored elegant candlestands spaced widely apart, each producing a dim and yellow glow. There were dark red wooden doors on both sides of the corridor that seemed to connect to different rooms. There was no sound from the rooms, making it virtually impossible to know what was hidden inside. Amon casually glanced at it and smiled with interest. Interesting. As the most powerful cryptologist, he naturally knew that this was a divine kingdom, one that couldn't be broken through with brute force. This was because every door was reassembled with different items. If he forcefully broke through them, he would trigger unknown effects. Amon didn't underestimate the abilities and intelligence of a Sequence Zero the Fool. He didn't plan on experiencing any more surprises or accidents. However, once the Divine Kingdom's rules were fixed, its owner would similarly be restricted to a certain extent. To put it simply, Klein was definitely in one of the rooms, not somewhere else. One had to bear the corresponding responsibility for the benefits obtained. You want to use this method to stall for time and stabilize your mental state? Amon whispered as though he was talking to an invisible person. Then, wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, he walked to the nearest dark red wooden door. There were no holes on the wooden door, so he couldn't see the exact situation inside. In other words, it was very difficult for Amon to know if Klein was here without opening the door. The corners of Amon's mouth curled up slightly. Amon extended his right hand and drew a long rectangular shape on the dark red wooden door. Inside the rectangle, bits of starlight emerged and turned transparent, revealing the scene in the room. With the authority of door and the ability of bug, Amon forcibly opened a window without triggering the effects. Following that, he cast his gaze into the room. There were no tables, chairs, carpets, and other furniture, but a blue sea. Indeed, this door has been connected with the sea outside, Amon said without any surprise. Once Peep twisted the door, he would leave Sapphira Castle and appear in the sea outside. And at that time, with Klein being wary, it was almost impossible for him to enter Sapphira Castle again, just like how Klein was unable to leave Sapphira Castle. This was the reason why Amon didn't forcibly destroy the Fool's divine kingdom, but opened one door at a time. Destruction led to similar effects. The repeated effects would affect Amon again and again. Even if there were many loopholes that he could use, he wouldn't be completely immune to them. Retracting his gaze, Amon walked to the opposite room and opened a window according to the method from before. However, this time, it was pitch black inside, and he couldn't see anything. Amon raised his hand and pinched the edge of his monocle and coughed lightly. His figure instantly split into two. The number of almonds increased. The split Amon glanced at Amon, who stood in the same spot and sked. Why aren't you seeking the thrill yourself? As he spoke, this Amon extended his right palm and grabbed the handle of the dark red wooden door. Just as he began twisting, his expression suddenly turned blank as Heap sat down, as though he had lost the ability to think. Fooling effect. The original Amon nodded slightly. The retarded Amon immediately collapsed and turned into a transparent worm with 12 segments. Tiny bits of Beyonder characteristics seeped out and returned to Amon's body. He relied on using the loophole to avoid the negative effects of his avatars from acting on his actual body. After all the Beyonder characteristics returned, Amon released a flame that had been stolen and burned the corpse of the Worm of Time. After doing this leisurely, he looked up and adjusted the monocle on his right eye. On the crystal monocle, countless symbols, patterns, and labels appeared. They moved quickly, interweaving, reforming, or changing, as though they were making calculations. This was a combination of a cryptologist's power of decryption and the key of Star's authority on position. The two attempts Amon made were mainly to gather intelligence, grasp the rules, and prepare for cracking the secrets of the Fool's divine kingdom. Soon, the symbols, patterns, and labels formed a scene on the monocle. Behind a dark red wooden door, a few slippery tentacles extended out from Klein's body. He sat on a high-backed chair and calmly watched the entrance. The corners of Amon's mouth curled up. With a flash, he appeared in the room. However, everything before his eyes suddenly collapsed. Klein with the Fool's aura quickly turned thin, turning into a card. On the card, Roselle Gustave was wearing a gorgeous head accessory and colorful clothes, holding a stick with luggage hanging from it. His eyes were filled with longing. The Fool card. The Fool card from the Cards of Blasphemy. Klein knew that relying solely on paper figurine substitutes and adding the fooling effect and grafting his true aura onto it wouldn't be able to deceive a top-notch swindler like Amon. Therefore, he used the Fool card, which had some convergence powers, as his paper figurine. Although Sapphira Castle couldn't be used again, this was Klein's home ground after all. There was his junk pile, the various items he had gathered, and the newly obtained Trunsoist brass book and the borrowed magic wishing lamp. Chapter 1383 Stipulated Rules. With the Klein in front of Amon turning into the Fool card, the room shrank and revealed its original appearance. It was an iron cigar case that had marks of being corroded slightly. It had fused with the aura of Sapphira Castle. Klein's figure appeared out of nowhere as the entire divine kingdom of the Fool collapsed. As the magnificent palace reappeared, he grabbed the vessel that carried the Fool card and Amon's true body and suddenly closed it. He didn't have hopes of using this item to seal Amon, who wielded the corresponding authority of the door pathway. All he wanted was to buy some time and find a chance to throw Amon out of Sapphira Castle and retrieve the initiative. But at that moment, Klein, who was wearing a black trench coat, paused. His other hand took out a crystal monocle from the void with his other hand and placed it in his right eye. Behind him, Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, quickly outlined his figure. His eyes were dark and wild as he laughed. "What made you think that I didn't use an avatar?" Before he finished his sentence, Klein's figure that had been parasitized rapidly turned thin, turning into a crude paper figurine. Klein was cautious and hadn't used his true form either. He relied on a paper figurine substitute that had spirit body threads grafted. He knew very well that he would rather give up an opportunity than make mistakes when fighting Amon. Once he made a mistake, under the suppression effect of a bug, it would be very difficult for him to turn the tables. With regards to the situation of the prey turning into a paper figurine, Amon didn't seem to be surprised. All he did was raise his hand to touch the crystal monocle. At the other end of the Grand Palace, Klein, who was wearing a top hat and a trench coat, uncontrollably walked out of the Fool's automatic concealment. He raised his right hand and took out a crystal monocle from the void with great difficulty, slowly moving it towards his right eye. During this process, Klein's expression was filled with resistance and rather warped, as though he couldn't control his hand. The half-crazy Amon smiled leisurely. "You can use paper figurines to replace you, but so can paper figurines replace you. It being parasitized is equivalent to you being parasitized. Everything is relative, and all of them have loopholes. No beyond a power is uncrackable. They can be used in any suitable situation." He made use of the relationship of the paper figurine substitute and the main body to create a bug. Although Amon looked like he was unable to control his desire to speak due to his madness, it didn't stop him from corroding Klein with his full strength. He strengthened the parasitizing bit by bit, making Klein truly wear a monocle and become him. At that moment, Klein's body suddenly collapsed. He had taken the initiative to do so. He split into countless transparent maggots that swam in all directions. Among these worms of spirit, there were a few worms of time with 12 segments mixed in. Strictly speaking, Amon's worms of time could forcefully parasitize very tiny creatures like the worms of spirit. However, when Klein split up, he took the initiative to use his fooling authority to confuse the order of time. He fooled the few worms of time, making them split up only towards the end. Unable to find the cluster of worms of spirit, They lost their target for parasitizing. In the next second, the scene in Saphira Castle changed again. Klein once again used the Realm of Mystery's powers to create a new divine kingdom for the fool. Amon instantly entered a room. This place was covered with a thick yellow carpet with a crystal chandelier hanging from it. There was a door on each wall, and it was unknown where they led to. At the same time, there were oil paintings depicting various eyes hanging from the four walls. There was no need for any special scrutiny. With just a glance, Amon knew that the four doors corresponded to different effects. The main purpose was to delay his actions and create enough time for Klein to make subsequent preparations. The corners of Mr. Error curled up slightly as he cast his gaze to the ground. He extended his right fist and stretched out his fingers. An illusory door appeared on the thick yellow carpet. The door quickly moved for a second before it became fixed in place and silently opened. However, with the opening of the illusory door, the doors around the room began to move strangely. The doors creaked and opened. Almost at the same time, in the pitch-black wilderness, in a dark tower that led to the sky, Klein was holding the magic wishing lamp and removing the effects of fooling on the Trunsoist brass book. The candle wick of the magic wishing lamp lit up as it spewed out a sticky, pale gold glow. These rays of light transformed into a distorted, blurry figure. Klein didn't consider making a wish with the genie to transfer Bernadette's wishes onto him and change the ownership of the magic wishing lamp. This was because there would only be one outcome. He would die on the spot and return from the fog of history with the miracle invoker's powers. Normally, this was a good way to escape, especially since Klein could revive several times. However, the situation this time was completely different from before. Once Klein died, it would mean that he had temporarily given up on his identity as the owner of Saphira Castle, making this place a paradise for Amon. He could use this Saphira without any obstruction. Under such circumstances, Amon could completely fool history, interfere with fate, and suppress Klein's resurrection, making him truly die. The ones who were most effective against a Beyonder were definitely higher sequence Beyonders of the same pathway. Therefore, Klein's current plan was to use the status of the genie to better use the Trunsoist brass book. If the genie didn't exert a certain influence, the rules set by the Trunsoist brass book definitely wouldn't be biased towards Klein. It would only restrict all existences other than itself. As the genie's blurry, pale gold figure took form, the Trunsoist brass book produced the sound of colliding metal and quickly flipped to the second half of the book that allowed writing. Without any gap in time, new text appeared on the brass page. Theft is prohibited here. If Klein had the choice, the most suitable rule would be acts of theft are prohibited here, because the former clause was a law. It couldn't stop someone from committing theft ahead of time, and it could only deliver punishment after the act. Furthermore, punishment for first-time thieves was inevitably light, something the Amons could withstand. His idea restricted the possibility of such actions. There was no such thing as theft. However, there was no way for the Trunsoist brass book to make such a rule right now. One had to wait until the provisions were watertight enough, and that it had awakened to a certain extent before that was possible. Previously, the genie had relied on his close connection with the Trunsoist brass book, his high status, and all his strength before he could enforce similar rules. At this moment, he was already drained and unable to do such things. At present, all Klein could do was try his best to stall for time, so that the Trunsoist brass book could produce a sufficiently strict setup of laws to target Amon so as to act in concert with his fooling authority. At this moment, in the room that trapped Amon, as the illusory door on the ground opened, the four real doors shook and cracks appeared. This would bring about many unknown effects. Suddenly, the sound of a bell rang out from an endless distance away. At some point in time, Amon had transformed into an ancient, mottled stone wall clock. On the wall clock, the second hand formed by the worm of time suddenly paused. Gong! As the bell reverberated, everything in the room froze strangely, including the four doors. The only exception was Amon. He had transformed back to his pointy-hatted classic black-robed look. With a smile, he calmly raised his left hand and tightened his 5 fingers. In the next second, the strange frozen state was broken. The four doors that were about to open had closed again with a bang, leaving no gaps behind. Amon's figure descended and burrowed into the illusory door that wasn't closed. Just as he used this method to leave the room, he discovered that he had arrived in a pitch-black wilderness. There was a dark tower that seemed to pierce the sky in the distance. Inside the tower, the Trunsoist brass book in front of Klein had formed a second rule. Deception is prohibited here. Although Amon couldn't see what was happening, it was as though he had sensed something. After all, a high-ranking person who used the rules of deception as entertainment was undoubtedly able to sense the changes in the rules. Otherwise, there was no way of accurately finding loopholes. He immediately raised his hand and adjusted the monocle stuck in his right eye. On the surface of the crystal monocle, a blinding pure white light spewed out, illuminating the wilderness. There were no longer any concealed existences here. This was the eternal daytime that he had previously given to Klein and retrieved from Klein's main body. In such an environment, the dark tower melted inch by inch. Klein floated in midair with one hand holding the magic wishing lamp, and the other holding the staff of the stars. In front of him was the open Trunsoist brass book. Amon took the opportunity to stretch out his hand that was holding onto the monocle. From a distance, he gripped Klein's projection to his palm. Behind him, the shadow that had been dragged out by the eternal daytime seemed to become fainter as it twisted with vitality. Without a sound, Amon began stealing Klein's various beyonder powers. He didn't deliberately seek out the fooling authority. Instead, he chose to be random to increase the success rate. However, with a flash of light, what fell into his palm was only a simple paper figurine. Grafting. Pa! The shadow behind Amon's back was lashed by an invisible whip, and he was completely unharmed. He created an error, letting his shadow replace him. Following that, Amon laughed as his voice resounded in Klein's ears. "Genie, I can also promise to send you back to the cosmos. Look, I wasn't punished. This means that I'm not swindling you." Chapter 1384 Conceptualization. Upon hearing Amon's words, Klein's heart sank. Before this, he wasn't worried that Amon would collude with Genie, because he was a top-notch swindler. No promises he made could be believed. As for Genie, he had encountered the former Lord of the Mysteries. He was considered a victim of such matters in a similar vein. Therefore, he would definitely use his most wary of approaches to deal with Mr. Error. This was the result of a lack of trust. Sometimes, lying, cheating and swindling could indeed increase the profits in the short term, but in the long term, it was better to be honest. But now, the Trunsoist brass book had just formulated the rule of deception is prohibited here, and Amon didn't receive any punishment after making the promise. At the same time, Klein and Genie didn't notice him using any loopholes. This proved how true and effective Amon's words were. It was from the bottom of his heart and wasn't a scam. Genie could even rely on his own level and traits to distort the sentence from "I can promise" to "I promise." It would make it impossible for Amon to go back on his word. If he did, he would suffer damage at the level of a great old one. This made Klein not help but wonder if the rule that deception is prohibited here was secretly guided by Amon or deliberately created by Genie, making any Lord of the Mysteries candidate to promise to return him to the cosmos. To Genie, he didn't suffer any losses in such a deal because Klein himself owed him a promise. If it were any other scene, Klein would still have the time to communicate with Genie and rebuild his trust. However, at this moment, Amon's threat was right before his eyes. He wouldn't give him the chance to resolve this problem. If he chose to continue to believe in Genie, Klein would be putting his life in the hands of this outer deity and be under his control. In the subsequent battle, as long as Genie was able to formulate a few rules that appeared to be fine but were biased towards Amon through the Trunsoist brass book, Klein, who was already at a great disadvantage, would rapidly lose with no way to reverse the situation. As his thoughts raced, Klein made the choice of this gamble. A translucent dark-colored cloak instantly appeared around him. His face was covered with a strange and distorted mask. The fool! Invisible rings rippled from his body and instantly enveloped Genie, the Trunsoist brass book, and the entire wilderness, as well as Amon. Blind stupidity, authority. Amon's monocle temporarily lost its luster, as though he had lost his vision. His gaze also turned dull. The speed of text being written on the Trunsoist brass book clearly slowed down as though it would take 15 minutes or even hours to think up the next rule. Genie's blurry and distorted golden figure shook as it suddenly shrank back into the golden magic lamp that looked like a water flask. It was unknown if it was escaping or if it was purely an instinctual reaction. Seizing this opportunity, Klein attempted to escape Sapphira Castle as he prepared to graft something to himself. Just as his consciousness sank, the crystal monocle appeared at the edge of Sapphira Castle, blocking his path. Even though his intelligence had been reduced briefly, Amon still seemed to remember to stop Klein from leaving Sapphira Castle. His eyes quickly regained clarity as they were still dyed black. His mouth slowly opened as he laughed uncontrollably. I've written this matter into my instinct. This is a good way to resist the effects of blind stupidity. Clearly he had cheated the rules and lied to himself, making his instincts believe that this was what he'd wanted. Klein wasn't depressed. He immediately completed the grafting he had prepared long ago. In the cosmos, a giant star that emitted light and heat suddenly dimmed. In the wilderness with the effects of eternal daylight, an orange sun with a destructive aura and a heavy feeling descended from the sky. The entire wilderness collapsed and curled up as though it was going to charge straight into the star. At the same time, everything here was ignited, including Amon. In the next second, the surrounding void began to shrink as they revolved around the real sun. Everything in the world either disintegrated or vaporized. All that was left was the magic wishing lamp and the Trunsoist brass book, which was still struggling to withstand the flames, barely suffering any damage. Klein, who was floating in midair, had long disappeared. He had grafted himself to that star. Of course, his grafting was only with the concept of a star, not a physical entity. Otherwise, with the Fool's obviously lower defense than most sequence OS, he would be directly swallowed by a real star and die on the spot thanks to his relatively weak body. The Fool was a very extreme deity. He had the ability to destroy a star, but he was unable to face it directly. His strengths and weaknesses were equally obvious. In addition, conceptualized objects couldn't directly affect the surrounding environment and harm the enemy. It wasn't enough to write the words immense mass, gravity, high temperatures, high heat, and fusion to create similar effects, but as Mr. Fool, Klein held the authority of fooling. He made his surroundings change according to the concept of a star. This was an intense change and also a type of fooling. Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, was completely ignited under the illumination of the star. He began to vaporize. At this moment, his figure distorted as he was instantly dyed with resplendent starlight. He turned extremely illusory, as though he had transformed into an astral door. At that moment, Amon no longer resembled a physical creature. He was closer to a collective body of the symbols like wandering, astral world tunnel, key, and door. This was the ability of a planeswalker to use the astral world to head to different planets and worlds. They were able to transform themselves into symbols, allowing them to effectively use the astral world. At Sequence O door stage, the qualitative change in such powers became conceptualized. Amon transformed himself into a concept creature and avoided the damage brought by the star. A figure suddenly appeared behind him. It was Klein, who was wearing a trench coat and a top hat. Almost at the same time, Amon's thoughts slowed down a little. His spirit body threads were grabbed by Klein. Using the chaos brought by the star, Klein dispelled the combination he had with the corresponding concepts, and he secretly grafted the location of both parties and arrived behind Amon. Originally, without the concept of reassembly, the star's influence on the surroundings would immediately stop. However, Klein had fooled time, allowing the effects of the first 2 seconds to linger until now, allowing him to fool Amon. If possible, what Klein wished to do now was to deepen the control of Amon's spirit body threads and turn him into his marionette. However, he knew very well that in the present situation, the probability of success was very low. On the one hand, Amon could withstand damage and steal the spirit body threads back. On the other hand, he might be able to use the connection established between the two of them via the spirit body threads to use a bug and influence Klein and parasitize him. Before he had absolute confidence, Klein didn't want his actions to appear rash. The main goal of capturing Amon's spirit body threads was to give the other party a certain sense of sluggishness. This was a performance of the fooling authority during the stage of transforming into a marionette. And with Klein's present state, he was naturally more willing to choose such a low-level but effective method. This would be less of a burden on him, and it wouldn't seriously affect his mental stability like when he used the authority of fooling. At this moment, apart from Amon, his enemy also included the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in his body. Of course, Amon was the same. If he didn't suppress the celestial worthy's madness, the latter would have already revived in his body. After creating a brief pause in Amon's thoughts, Klein had 3 choices. The first was to take this opportunity to escape Sapphira Castle, but he wasn't sure if Amon's instincts were still working and would still attempt to stop him from escaping. Second, It was to summon the projections of the historical void, but it wasn't of much use. The effects of an angel-level existence could do little in this battle of gods. It was possible that they couldn't withstand Amon's gaze, much less their historical projections. Even if Klein wanted to use it to transmit information, it lacked sufficient value. The other deities couldn't enter Sapphira Castle and provide help. Third, he could use this opportunity to exert a certain amount of influence on Amon's true body. Without any hesitation, Klein chose the third plan. He wanted to take the opportunity to graft Amon, Sapphira Castle, and the Door of Light that was stained with bluish-black together. Klein felt that Amon's half-crazy state wasn't bad enough. He just appeared rather talkative, with him occasionally not grasping an opportunity. He wanted to make him go crazier. When Amon and Sapphira Castle completed the reassembly, the celestial worthies will in his body would clearly strengthen, and the chaos in his mind would intensify. That way, Amon would lack the rationality to restrain himself, making his actions more instinctive than being the result of a contemplative thinking process. To Mr. Error, who was an expert at deceit, this would be fatal. Of course, Klein could only maintain this kind of grafting for a second. Exceeding this limit might mean that he would no longer be facing Amon, but the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. When the time came, the other party would definitely gladly accept the gift of Sapphira Castle. He could then fight Sequence O the Fool with a Sapphira, 2 uniquenesses, and the corresponding Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics. Originally, Klein could have relied on his fooling authority to reduce Amon's intelligence, but firstly, he wasn't able to use power at this level for a long time in his current state. Secondly, as a dual-pathway true god, and a wielder of many authorities, the duration of the blind stupidity effect on him was rather limited. Therefore, Klein had no choice but to take the risk of grafting things in such a way. And madness would accompany Amon, doing so until he found a new balance or met the best psychiatrist. In the blink of an eye, the translucent, cold mask appeared on Klein's face once again. A strange door of light that was stained with a hint of bluish-black suffused from Amon's body. Sapphira Castle. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.